In the early 13th century, a man born in poverty on a wind-scoured steppe with no palace, no treasury, and no army to speak of, looked out across the known world and decided it was not enough. Within 2 generations, his descendants would rule from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. No empire before or since has ever covered so much of the Earth's surface. Tonight, we follow that story from its beginning in the cold grass of Mongolia to its slow unravelling across centuries. Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. Tonight's journey takes us somewhere vast, somewhere windscraped and wide open, where the horizon seems to go on forever and where history, without much warning, decided to change direction completely. We're going to follow the story of the Mongol Empire from its very first breath to its final exhale, and I promise you, it is one of the most extraordinary stories ever lived, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Someone is always listening from somewhere that genuinely surprises me, and I appreciate every single one of you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Put the phone face down, stretch out, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. This one runs long, intentionally. The Mongol Empire is not a story you can rush. It covers more geography than any empire in history, spans more than 2 centuries of conquest and transformation, and touches more lives than almost any other single political force the world has ever seen. So we are going to take our time, move through it chapter by chapter, and let the story wash over you at the pace it deserves. There are going to be moments that astonish you, moments that genuinely horrify you, and frankly, moments that will make you wonder how any of this was even possible. Because when you actually sit with the facts of what the Mongols achieved, starting from nothing on the wind-beaten steppe of Central Asia, it is almost unreasonable. Almost. But first things first. Get comfortable. The grass is long, the fire is low, the stars over Mongolia are absolutely ridiculous in the best way, and the story is just beginning. The steppe before the storm. Central Asia before the Mongols. Long before anyone had heard the name Genghis Khan, the Eurasian steppe was already one of the most dynamic and dangerous places on Earth. Stretch your imagination across the middle of the world. Not the coastlines, not the river valleys, not the cities, but the vast inland sea of grass that runs from the edges of Hungary in the west, all the way to Manchuria in the east. This belt of grassland, thousands of kilometers wide in places, broken by deserts and mountain ranges and great rivers, was home to some of the most formidable peoples in all of human history. Long before Temüjin was born, this landscape had produced the Scythians, the Huns, the Turks, and dozens of other groups who had swept down from the steppe and terrified settled civilizations for millennia. The steppe was not a wasteland. It was a different kind of world, one that most settled people never really understood and often fatally underestimated. Life there was shaped by grass and animals. The nomads of the steppe followed their herds of horses, sheep, goats, and cattle across enormous seasonal circuits, moving between summer pastures in the north and winter camps where the valleys gave some shelter from the killing cold. The entire economy, the entire culture, the entire military capacity of steppe peoples rested on this relationship with animals, particularly with horses. Mongol horses were not the tall, elegant animals of Persian or European cavalry traditions. They were small, shaggy, almost pony-like creatures that could survive on almost nothing, dig through snow to find grass in winter, and travel extraordinary distances without grain. A Mongol warrior might rotate through 5 or 6 horses on a day's ride, preserving each animal's strength. The result was a cavalry force with a range and speed that no settled army could match. When people say the Mongols moved fast, they mean it in a way that requires some sitting with. Mongol armies covered distances in weeks that European armies might have taken months to cross. And they did it while fighting. But before Genghis Khan, the steppe was not unified. Not even close. It was a patchwork of tribes, each with its own identity, its own seasonal ranges, its own feuds, its own claims of honor and history. The Mongols themselves were one of many groups in the eastern steppe, and in the mid-12th century, the era into which Temüjin would be born, they were not the most powerful, not by a long stretch. The major powers of the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century included the Tatars, who had long been allied with the Yuan Dynasty of northern China, and who were considered a serious military threat. There were the Karaites, a larger and more politically sophisticated tribe whose leaders had converted to Nestorian Christianity. There were the Naimans in the west, a powerful confederation with closer ties to Central Asian culture. There were the Merkits in the north, fierce and proud, and there were the Taichuts, who had their own relationship with the Mongol clans and who would play a dark role in Temüjin's early life. The politics of the steppe were relentless. Alliances formed and collapsed with the seasons. Cattle were raided. Women were kidnapped as a deliberate tool of political humiliation and demographic absorption. Blood feuds passed from father to son across generations. A tribe that was dominant in one decade might be shattered and scattered in the next. There was no permanent structure, no written law, no state apparatus. Power rested entirely on the personal charisma of a leader, the loyalty of his followers, and the outcome of the last battle. This was the world into which Temüjin was born. And here is the thing that makes his story so remarkable. Nothing about that world suggested it would produce a universal empire. Plenty of steppe leaders before him had risen, conquered, terrified, settled civilizations, and then faded. The Mongols before Temüjin had no writing, no cities, no tradition of large-scale administration. They were one fragmented group among many on a landscape defined by fragmentation. The settled civilization surrounding the steppe regarded its people with a mixture of contempt and anxiety. The Yuan Dynasty in northern China actively managed the steppe tribes, playing them off against one another, executing threatening leaders, and generally treating the nomads as a perpetual low-level problem to be managed rather than a mortal threat. The Islamic world of Central Asia was wealthy, urban, and sophisticated, with great cities like Samarkand and Bukhara that had been centres of learning and trade for centuries. To these people, the horse-riding herdsmen of the eastern steppe were primitive, dangerous in the way that a storm is dangerous, but not worthy of serious diplomatic concern. They were, as history would shortly demonstrate, catastrophically wrong. The steppe was not a place of stasis. It was a place of constant movement, constant competition, and beneath the surface of endless tribal warfare, an extraordinary culture had developed. Steppe peoples were among the finest archers in the world, training from childhood to shoot with accuracy from horseback at full gallop. They had developed complex oral traditions, intricate social codes, and a spiritual life rooted in shamanism that gave meaning to the vast, open, sky-dominated landscape they inhabited. They were not primitive. They were differently organized. And in the hands of the right leader, that different organization would prove to be one of the most lethal forces in human history. The stage was set. The world was full of confident empires and prosperous cities, none of which could quite imagine what was coming. And somewhere on the steppe, in a year historians still debate, a boy was born to a woman who had been kidnapped on the way to her own wedding. The boy who would shake the earth. Temüjin's early life, around 1162, and I want to be honest with you, historians genuinely argue about this date, so let's say approximately 1162 and move on. A boy was born near the Onon River in what is now northeastern Mongolia. His father, Yesuge, was the leader of a small Mongol clan, not a great chief, not a king, but a man of standing and reputation in the local tribal hierarchy. His mother, Holan, had recently been kidnapped from her first husband, a Merkit man named Chiladu, while the two were returning from their wedding. Yesuge had intercepted the couple, taken Holan by force, and made her his wife. This kind of thing was not exactly celebrated, but was not unusual on the steppe either. Bride kidnapping was a tool of tribal politics. It was still a traumatic act for everyone involved, and Holan spent the rest of her life defined partly by that dispossession. The baby was named Temüjin, which means roughly ironworker or smith, and according to legend, he was born clutching a blood clot in his fist, an omen, the shaman said, of a warrior destined for greatness. Historians appropriately note that this kind of birth legend gets attached to a lot of historical figures after the fact, but the detail endured in the records because the secret history of the Mongols, compiled after his death, preserved it, and whatever you think of the omen, the boy himself certainly lived up to it. Temüjin's early childhood was, on the surface, the childhood of a minor noble's son on the steppe. He had brothers and half-brothers, grew up riding horses and learning to shoot, understood from an early age the complex web of alliances and obligations that governed steppe life. His father was planning for his future already, and around 1172, when Temüjin was perhaps 9 or 10 years old, Yesuge took him east to the family of his future bride. The girl's name was Borte. She was the daughter of a leader of the Ongirat people, and she and Temüjin apparently liked each other well enough. Yesuge left his son with Borte's family according to custom, so the children could get to know one another before the formal marriage, and headed home. On the way, he stopped to share a meal with a group of Tatars. The Tatars and the Mongols had old blood between them. Yasuge either did not know he had been recognized or underestimated the danger. The Tatars poisoned him. By the time he reached home, he was dying. Temüjin was summoned back urgently, but arrived only in time to watch his father die. And here is where the story turns genuinely dark. After Yasuge's death, his clan, the Taichuts and his own followers, abandoned the family. This was the brutal arithmetic of steppe survival. A woman with young children and no male protector of standing was a liability, not an asset. The clan packed up and moved on, deliberately leaving Holan and her children. Temüjin, his brothers Kasar, Kachyun and Temüge, and 2 half-brothers, behind with almost nothing. What followed were years of genuine poverty and danger. The family survived on whatever they could forage: roots, berries, fish caught from rivers, the occasional small animal. Holan, by all accounts a remarkable and ferocious woman, held the family together through sheer force of will. She is one of the unsung figures in this whole story, and the secret history treats her with a respect that feels earned. She did not break, she adapted. Temüjin grew up in these years understanding dispossession from the inside. He understood what it felt like to be abandoned by those who should have protected you, to be left with nothing and have to claw your way back from nothing. This is not an excuse for what he later became, but it is a context. The man who would build the world's largest empire learned his first political lessons at the bottom. The hardships were not only material. When Temüjin was perhaps 13 or 14, a confrontation with his half-brothers over food ended with Temüjin and his brother Kasar killing one of the half-brothers. It was a violent, disturbing incident. Holan was furious. The family was already surviving on the edge, and internal killing was the last thing any of them needed. But it also revealed something about Temüjin. He did not accept challenges to his authority quietly. Then came the Taichuts. The Taichuts, who had abandoned the family, apparently decided at some point that Temüjin was growing old enough to be dangerous. Whether this was a rational threat assessment or old grievance recycled into action, they descended on the family and captured Temüjin. He was put in a wooden collar, a kange, and kept as a prisoner, passed from household to household as a kind of trophy or slave. He escaped, and the escape itself is one of those stories from the secret history that is either exactly as dramatic as it sounds, or heavily embroidered after the fact, and either way tells us something important about how the Mongols wanted to remember their leader. Temüjin used the wooden collar itself as a weapon, knocking out a Taichut guard, and fled into the night. He hid in a river, submerged up to his nose while searchers passed nearby. A man from the Suldus clan, a man named Sorkan Shira, found him and chose to hide him rather than turn him in, even though doing so put his own family at risk. Temüjin eventually made his way back to his mother and brothers. The lessons stacked up. Loyalty existed even among strangers if you treated people right. Endurance was possible in conditions that should have broken you, and people who had power over you, if you survived them, did not hold that power forever. Reunited with his family and growing in confidence, Temüjin retrieved Borte from her father's family and married her. It was a significant moment. The marriage gave him an alliance with the Ongirat and a social standing that began to attract followers. Young men drifted to his camp, drawn by reputation and the simple fact that Temüjin seemed like someone worth following. And then the Merkits came. The Merkits had not forgotten that Yasuge had kidnapped Holan from one of their own men. Debts of honor on the steppe could last generations. They descended on Temüjin's camp and took Borte. Temüjin, unlike the passive victim his early life might have suggested, did not accept this. He reached out to Togrul Khan, the powerful leader of the Karaite Confederation, who had been a sworn friend of his father. He reached out to Jamuka, a childhood friend who had become a figure of growing influence. And together they launched a rescue. The Merkits were defeated, Borte was recovered. She was pregnant, and the child born from that period, a boy named Jockey, would carry a shadow of uncertainty about his paternity for the rest of his life. Temüjin acknowledged Jockey as his son. He never publicly questioned it, but the ambiguity haunted the family and would eventually contribute to one of the empire's deepest fractures. The rescue of Borte was the moment when Temüjin stopped being a survivor and started becoming a leader. He had called in alliances, coordinated a military response, and succeeded. Followers came, reputation grew, and on the steppe, reputation was everything. He was perhaps in his mid-20s, He had been orphaned, abandoned, enslaved, and had his wife kidnapped. He had killed a brother, escaped captivity, and survived en route in the steppe winter, and he was just getting started. The rise. Forging alliances, defeating enemies. The decade between roughly 1185 and 1195 was Temüjin's apprenticeship in empire building, though he probably would not have used that word. He would have called it survival, or maybe just Tuesday. What he was doing, practically speaking, looked from the outside like the same thing every ambitious steppe leader had always done: building a coalition, attracting followers, securing alliances, winning battles, rewarding loyalty with the kind of extravagance that made men want to follow you into the next battle and the one after that. The difference was not in the actions themselves. It was in the particular clarity of vision Temüjin brought to what was otherwise a very familiar steppe political game. He saw further than his rivals, and he was more patient. And in the long run, patience on the steppe was more dangerous than any weapon. His relationship with Jamuka is one of the most fascinating and ultimately tragic threads running through the whole early part of this story, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Jamuka was Temüjin's Anda, his sworn blood brother. On the Mongolian steppe, this was not a casual bond. It was treated with something close to sacred weight, renewed through ritual, understood by everyone around both men as a tie that ran deeper than ordinary friendship or political alliance. The two had been close as children, had renewed that bond as adults, and after the rescue of Borte from the Merkits, they rode together for a stretch of time with their camps travelling in tandem, their followers intermingled, the whole arrangement humming along like a genuine partnership between two of the most capable men on the steppe. And then something shifted. The secret history is careful about this moment. It does not describe a single dramatic confrontation or a specific betrayal. What it describes is more subtle and more revealing. After roughly a year and a half of travelling together, followers began to choose, not loudly, not all at once. But the two camps began to develop distinct characters. Temüjin's people gathered among the herders and the animals, the ordinary working people of the steppe. Jamuka's people clustered with the aristocratic elite, the traditional noble families who had always held power. Two ways of being a leader. Two different theories about where authority comes from and who it belongs to. They separated, and on the steppe, in that political climate, separation was simply the polite beginning of rivalry. Temüjin's reputation grew steadily through the late 1180s. In 1189, a Kurultai, a formal gathering of the Mongol clans, named him Khan of the Mongols. It was not a universal title. Jamuka was not part of this. The Tatars and the Kerets and the Nemans carried on as before, entirely unaffected. But it was a formal recognition, and it meant that people now came to Temüjin in an organised political sense, rather than simply drifting toward his fire because he seemed like someone worth knowing. Jamuka was, understandably, not pleased. In 1190 he launched a military campaign against Temüjin and defeated him at a battle called Dalan Baljut. This is one of those moments in Temüjin's early career that tends to get quietly skipped over in the popular telling of the story, because it does not fit the narrative of inevitable, unstoppable rise. He lost, genuinely lost, a real military setback against a real opponent who outmaneuvered him. What happened next, though, is the interesting part. Jamuka reportedly had some of Temüjin's captured officers boiled alive. It was a brutal act, even by the standards of steppe warfare, which were not exactly gentle. And according to the sources, it drove people away from Jamuka. Potential followers, who might have drifted toward whichever man seemed strongest, looked at the boiling pots and quietly started walking in a different direction. Temüjin lost the battle and gained followers from the aftermath, which is either a remarkable piece of political fortune or evidence that he was already operating at a level of strategic sophistication his opponents had not quite caught up to, probably some of both. Through the following years, Temüjin worked closely with Kublai Khan of the Kerets, the powerful ruler who had been his father's sworn friend, and who represented both military muscle and the kind of legitimacy that came from being visibly allied with an established power. He helped Togrul fight his own internal struggles, and in return received military support, recognition, and the association of his growing reputation with a name that already commanded respect across the steppe. He was also simultaneously managing a relationship with the Yuan Dynasty of northern China, offering to help suppress Tatar raids in exchange for titles and formal recognition from the Chinese court. This is perhaps the least discussed aspect of Temüjin's early rise, and it is the most strategically impressive. He was running multiple political games at once: steppe politics, Chinese court politics, his own coalition building, all of it in motion simultaneously, each strand reinforcing the others. In 1196, Temüjin and Togrul moved against the Tatars on behalf of the Jin. The Tatars, who had poisoned Temüjin's father, he extracted full revenge. The Tatar men who measured taller than the axle of a wagon, meaning all adult males, were executed. Their children were absorbed into Mongol households, their identity subsumed into the people who had destroyed their fathers. This was the pattern Temüjin would repeat throughout his career: destroy the leadership, absorb the survivors, not extermination as an end in itself, but as a precise tool of political consolidation. The goal was always the same: no rival left standing, no memory strong enough to organize future resistance. By the early 1200s, the coalition he had built was formidable, but not yet unchallenged. His relationship with Togrul Khan had begun to curdle as Temüjin's power grew large enough to stop being an asset to the older man and start looking like a threat. There were intrigues at the Kerit court. A near assassination attempt that Temüjin apparently survived through a combination of warning and quick movement. A period of genuine danger in which the whole project of his rise might have unravelled. In 1203 he moved decisively. He struck the Kerets, defeated Togrul Khan, and the old ruler fled and was killed by the Naimans. Then, in 1204, Temüjin turned on the Naimans themselves. Their leader, Tayang Khan, had managed to assemble a broad coalition against him, drawing in the remnants of every group Temüjin had weakened or displaced, including, at last, Jamuka, who by now had been abandoned by most of his own followers and was reduced to attaching himself to whatever power might yet stop his old blood brother. It was not enough. The Naimans were broken. Tayang Khan died in the fighting. The coalition dissolved into flight and surrender. Jamuka survived a little longer. In 1206, his own remaining followers handed him over to Temüjin. The secret history gives us their final meeting, and whatever liberties the text may take with precise historical detail, the scene carries genuine weight. Temüjin wept, the text tells us. He offered mercy. He wanted his Anda back, or at least that is how the story remembers it. Jamuka refused. He asked for the death appropriate to a nobleman on the steppe, one that did not spill blood, rolled in felt blankets, beaten or suffocated. Temüjin granted it. In the end, they were mirror images, both intelligent, both capable of inspiring the kind of loyalty that made men follow them into genuinely dangerous places. What separated them was the kind of loyalty they were willing to build, and the size of the coalition they could imagine. Jamuka understood the steppe as it had always been. Temüjin was already building something for which the steppe had no name yet. The Tatars were gone, the Kerets were gone, the Naimans were gone, Jamuka was dead. Temüjin looked out across the Mongolian steppe and found, for the first time, no rival standing anywhere in sight. The Great Assembly. Genghis Khan is born in 1206 on the banks of the Onon River, where Temüjin had been born, a gathering was called. A Kurultai, a grand assembly of all the Mongol clans and their leaders. They came from across the steppe, leaders and warriors and families who had fought on different sides of the wars of the past 2 decades. Some of them had followed Temüjin from the beginning. Some had opposed him and been defeated. Some had shifted sides more than once. But now, in 1206, they all came. Because there was only one side left. A great white banner with 9 tails, the standard of the Mongol nation, was raised. And Temüjin, the man who had been abandoned in childhood, enslaved, dispossessed, and who had clawed his way back through 2 decades of steppe politics, was declared Genghis Khan. The title is contested in its precise translation. Oceanic ruler, universal sovereign, and a few other interpretations have been offered. What is not contested is what it meant in practice. It meant that the Mongols recognized one supreme leader, not a first among equals, not a Khan who ruled by consensus and could be replaced when the consensus shifted. One ruler, and the implications of that single fact would echo across the next century. Genghis Khan was not merely declared a ruler. He immediately began to reorganize Mongol society in ways that had no precedent. The traditional unit of steppe society was the clan. Identity, loyalty, military obligation, all of it was organized around the clan. Genghis Khan broke this. He reorganized the entire Mongol fighting force into units based not on clan membership, but on the decimal system. Groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. The leaders of these units were appointed by Genghis Khan himself, based on demonstrated loyalty and military ability, not hereditary clan standing. This sounds like a simple administrative reform. It was actually a social revolution. By breaking the army along clan lines and rebuilding it along merit and imperial appointment lines, Genghis Khan severed the traditional source of political power on the steppe. A clan chief was powerful because his clan followed him. But if his warriors were now organized into units that crossed clan lines, led by commanders who owed their position to the Khan and not to clan tradition, then clan chiefs were just men. Their traditional authority had been replaced by imperial appointment. The only authority that mattered now was Genghis Khan's. He was very thorough about this, deliberately thorough. He also established the Yasa, the Great Law. We do not have a complete written version of the Yasa, and historians debate exactly what it contained and how consistently it was applied. But from the sources we have, it included provisions against theft, adultery, and the failure to return lost property. It guaranteed freedom of religion across the empire, an extraordinary provision for its time. It codified loyalty to the Khan as the supreme obligation. It mandated that treason, betrayal, and abandonment in battle were capital offences. The Yasa was about creating predictability. If you followed the rules, you knew what to expect. Loyalty would be rewarded. Betrayal would be punished absolutely and without exception. This consistency was itself a form of power. It meant that people could calculate the benefits of submission against the costs of resistance, with some certainty about the outcome. Genghis Khan also established a personal guard, the Keshig, of around 10,000 elite warriors, who served as both his bodyguard and the training ground for future generals and commanders. Sons of leaders across the empire were sent to serve in the Keshig, which was partly an honour and partly a very sophisticated hostage system. But it also meant that the next generation of Mongol commanders trained together, developed personal loyalty to the Khan, and absorbed a common set of military values and practices. The people he elevated to the highest positions of trust around him came from everywhere in his early life. Loyal followers who had stayed with him when he had nothing, men who had shown extraordinary ability in battle, and even former enemies who had impressed him. A famous example is Jebe, who had once shot Genghis Khan's horse out from under him during a battle against the Naimans. After the victory, Genghis Khan asked who had fired the arrow. Jebe identified himself. Genghis Khan, rather than punishing him, gave him the nickname Jeba, meaning arrowhead, and made him a general, because a man brave enough to admit he had nearly killed the Khan was a man worth having on your side. By 1206 then, Genghis Khan had the following. One supreme authority on the steppe with no remaining rivals, a military force restructured on the decimal system with loyalty redirected toward the imperial centre, a legal code that offered predictability and protection to those who submitted, a personal guard that doubled as a leadership training program, and a set of generals and commanders of extraordinary quality. What he did not yet have was a direction to point all of this at. He would find one quickly. The world around the Mongol steppe was, as far as most of its inhabitants were concerned, much the same as it had always been. The Jin dynasty ruled northern China from behind formidable walls. The western Xia, the Tangut kingdom, occupied the region between Mongolia and the Jin heartland. The Khwarezmian Empire dominated Central Asia from modern Iran through Afghanistan and into modern Kazakhstan. The Islamic world was wealthy and confident. Europe was in the middle of the medieval period, busy with crusades and feudal politics. Nobody was particularly worried about a man on the Mongolian steppe who had just been given a title at tribal assembly, and that, as we are about to see, was the last mistake any of them would make. The first campaigns, Nduatse and the Jin dynasty. The first people to learn, concretely and painfully, what Genghis Khan's newly unified empire meant for the world beyond the Mongolian steppe were the Tanguts, and they learned it before most of the world even knew there was something new to be afraid of. The Western Xia, known also as Xixia, controlled a prosperous and genuinely sophisticated kingdom in what is now the northwestern part of modern China, sitting in the corridor of territory between the Mongol steppe to the north and the Jin dynasty's heartland to the east. They were not a peripheral people living in tents and hoping nobody noticed them. They had cities, real cities, with walls and palaces and libraries and temples and markets that moved goods between the steppe and the settled world. Their society was multi-ethnic, drawing on Buddhist culture, Chinese administrative traditions, and their own distinctly Tangut heritage. Their military had cavalry, infantry, and fortifications. They were, by any reasonable measure, a serious and established power, and they were, by the brutal logic of geography, directly in Genghis Khan's way. He launched his first major campaign against the Western Xia in 1205, before the Great Kurultai of 1206 had even made his universal authority official. Then he returned in 1207, then again in 1209, each time with larger forces and more deliberate intent. These early campaigns were, if we're being honest about what was happening, partly probing exercises. He was testing, learning, running experiments on a problem the Mongols had not previously had to solve at any serious scale. Because here was the thing. The Mongol military in 1205 was already extraordinary. The cavalry was among the finest in the world. The speed of movement was genuinely shocking to anyone who encountered it for the first time. The psychological ferocity, the deliberate cultivation of a reputation for overwhelming violence against those who resisted, contrasted with relative mercy toward those who submitted, was already a developed and consciously applied tool. Against armies in open field, against tribal confederations on the steppe, against anything that could be chased or encircled or run down, the Mongol force was devastating. But cities were a different problem entirely, and it is worth sitting with this for a moment, because it is easy to read the history of Mongol conquest as a single, unbroken arc of dominance, and forget that there were genuine limitations that had to be figured out along the way. You cannot scare a wall into submission. You cannot use feigned retreat against a fortress. A fortified city with adequate supplies and a determined garrison could simply close its gates and wait, and the cavalry that was so lethal in open terrain became considerably less impressive when it was trotting back and forth in front of stone walls with nothing useful to do. The Mongols in these early campaigns could devastate the countryside around a city, strip its agricultural base, cut its supply lines, make life outside the walls impossible. But bringing down the walls themselves required equipment and techniques they did not yet have in any sophisticated form. The Western Xia capital held. Genghis Khan, with a clear-eyed practicality that is one of his most underappreciated qualities, accepted tribute rather than press an assault he was not yet equipped to guarantee winning. The Western Xia became a tributary state, paying tribute and formally acknowledging Mongol supremacy, but surviving intact, not yet destroyed. This looked like tactical limitation. It was actually good strategy. The Western Xia now provided both a buffer zone and a resource base for what Genghis Khan was already thinking about. The next target, the far more ambitious one waiting to the east, the Jin dynasty of northern China. The Jin deserve a moment of introduction, because understanding what they were helps explain why what happened to them matters as much as it does. They had been founded by the Jurchen people, who were themselves originally a steppe and forest people from Manchuria, who had conquered northern China roughly a century earlier and settled into the role of Chinese rulers with considerable success. By 1211, the Jin controlled the northern portion of China, an enormous territory with a massive population, extraordinary agricultural and manufacturing wealth, and the most sophisticated defensive infrastructure in the world. Their walls were not just the famous Great Wall, which at this point was a patchwork of older fortifications in various states of repair, rather than the continuous stone barrier that later centuries would build. What the Jin had was a comprehensive defensive system. Fortified cities, regular garrisons, administrative networks designed specifically to manage the steppe threat that had always existed to their north. They had faced steppe raiders for a long time. They had developed policies and systems to deal with them. One of those policies was the deliberate management of steppe politics, playing tribes off against one another, supporting weaker groups against stronger ones, preventing any single leader from accumulating enough power to pose a genuine strategic threat. They had earlier in Temüjin's career offered him titles and recognition, a way of domesticating an ambitious steppe leader by making him feel included in the Jin's political framework. Genghis Khan had accepted those titles when they were useful. They were not useful anymore, and he had absolutely no intention of being managed. He launched the first major campaign against the Jin in 1211. The crossing of the Gobi Desert to reach the Jin frontier is itself worth noting as a logistical achievement. Crossing one of the world's great deserts with a large military force is not a trivial undertaking, and the fact that the Mongols managed it with the speed they maintained throughout their campaigns says something about the quality of the army's organisation and the endurance of the horses and men involved. What the Jin commanders encountered when the Mongol force arrived was something their entire defensive system had been designed to manage and had apparently not quite imagined at this scale. The speed was wrong. The force came from unexpected directions. The Jin strategy of concentrating defenders in fortified positions relied on being able to identify where the threat was coming from and respond with sufficient lead time. The Mongols moved fast enough to disrupt this calculus entirely. In open field against Jin cavalry and infantry units that came out to meet them, the Mongol approach was already completely developed and devastatingly effective. Speed and mobility to prevent the Jin from massing their forces. The feigned retreat, that brilliant and endlessly reusable trick of pulling back to draw pursuing cavalry forward into prepared kill zones. Encirclement, cutting off forces that had been separated from support, annihilating them before they could regroup. Psychological terror, applied with deliberate calculation and amplified by the treatment of cities and populations that chose to resist rather than submit. But against the Jin's fortified cities, Genghis Khan faced the same problem he had encountered with the Western Seer, now at a much larger scale. And here is where one of his most important qualities shows itself most clearly. He adapted. He recruited. From the Jin's own population, from defectors and captives and people who had reason to transfer their loyalty, he brought in Chinese engineers, siege specialists, men who understood the military technology of the fortified city. He acquired catapults and trebuchets. He learned to deploy fire as a weapon against wooden structures within city walls. He developed through these campaigns the practice of using captured civilian populations, driven ahead of his armies at sword point, which is genuinely horrifying, as human shields and labour forces during siege operations. The ethical dimensions of this were not something Genghis Khan spent much time agonising over. The campaigns against the Jin were not a single swift conquest. They lasted, with interruptions and redirections, for more than 20 years. This is important context for understanding what the Mongol Empire actually was in operation. It was not an unstoppable force rolling smoothly across the map. It was a sustained military and political project, maintained across 2 decades, that defeated Jin field armies repeatedly in open battle, while simultaneously developing the siege capabilities needed to take their cities, while also managing the political complexity of a multi-front empire that was simultaneously doing other things in other directions. The Mongols ravaged the Jin countryside systematically. The agricultural base that supported the Jin's enormous population was stripped away, region by region. Cities fell one by one. Some surrendered when the Mongol army appeared outside their walls, recognizing the mathematics of the situation with cold clarity. Others resisted and paid for it in ways the surviving accounts struggle to describe adequately. The Jin capital, Zhongdu, corresponding roughly to the location of modern Beijing, was besieged in 1213. The Jin emperor, reading the situation correctly if too late, fled south. The city itself, enormous and heavily fortified and containing one of the great populations of the medieval world, held out for 2 more years before the Mongol strategy of stripping its supply lines and starving it into submission finally worked. Zhongdu fell in 1215. A traveller who passed through the region years afterward described the bones of the dead piled so high outside the walls that they formed hills. Medieval accounts inflate numbers and dramatise horror as a matter of course, so the specific image should be taken as impression rather than precise description. But impressions come from somewhere. The reality was catastrophic, and then Genghis Khan did something that is easy to overlook, but that reveals a great deal about how he thought. He did not stay in China to complete the conquest personally. He withdrew, leaving his general Mukhali, one of the most capable commanders in the Mongol military, a man who had been with Temüjin since the early days of the rise, and who had earned extraordinary trust over decades, in charge of continuing operations against the Jin. Mukhali would spend the rest of his life managing the ongoing campaign in northern China, making steady progress, holding what had been taken, pressing forward where he could. Genghis Khan turned west, because news had arrived from Central Asia that required his personal attention, in a way that nothing in China currently did. But before we follow him there, it is worth pausing on what the Jin campaign had done to the Mongol Empire beyond the obvious territorial gains. Something less visible but ultimately more consequential had happened during these years. Conquest introduces conquerors to new things. The Jin campaign introduced the Mongols to Chinese administrators, to Chinese ideas about record-keeping and tax collection, and bureaucratic governance, to Chinese engineering and Chinese medicine, and Chinese approaches to organizing large populations. None of this was lost on Genghis Khan. He understood, with that same quality of clear-eyed pragmatism that led him to accept tribute from the Western Xia, rather than waste resources on an assault he could not guarantee, that conquest was one thing and administration was quite another. Winning a battle was a skill the Mongols had mastered completely. Keeping a functioning empire running across vast distances and diverse populations was a different skill, and it required different kinds of people. He brought back from the Chinese campaigns not just plunder, though there was plunder in enormous quantities, but human capital, scribes who could read and write, engineers who understood construction and fortification, administrators who knew how to organize a taxable population, doctors, advisors, people who understood the machinery of civilized governance from the inside, who could be put to work building the administrative architecture that the military conquests were outrunning. He was building as he conquered, absorbing the tools of the civilizations he was dismantling and turning those tools toward the construction of something new. This is more than most conquerors managed. Most conquerors took the wealth and left the structure to collapse. Genghis Khan was already thinking about what came after the battle, even while the battle was still in progress. It is one of the things that made him genuinely unlike almost anyone else in the historical record. And the world to his west was about to find out exactly what that meant. The Naiman, the Kara-Khitai, and the edge of the Islamic world. While the campaigns against the Jin dynasty ground steadily forward under Mukhali's able management in northern China, Genghis Khan's attention was pulled westward by a figure who had become a particular irritant, not a major power, not a serious military threat, just an irritant. A loose end from an earlier campaign that had refused to tie itself off neatly. The loose end's name was Kuchlug. Kuchlug was a Naiman prince, a survivor of the Naiman confederation that Genghis Khan had destroyed back in 1204. When his father Tayang Khan's coalition collapsed and the Naimans were broken, Kuchlug had done what survivors of Mongol campaigns often did if they were fast enough and lucky enough. He ran west. Far west. He eventually landed in the Kara-Khitai Empire, a kingdom occupying the territory north and east of the Khwarezmian Empire in what is now roughly Kazakhstan and the surrounding parts of Central Asia. The Kara-Khitai had their own layered and interesting history. They had been founded by Khitan people who had themselves been displaced when the Yuan conquered their homeland generations earlier. Refugees who had travelled west and built a new kingdom in Central Asia and managed it with reasonable competence for over a century. By the early 13th century they were a going concern, a real state with real administrative structures, sitting in a strategically significant position between the Mongol Empire to the east and the Khwarezmian Empire to the west. And Kuchlug had, through a combination of charm, military ability, and the kind of patient political manoeuvring that suggests he was considerably more capable than his eventual fate might imply, worked his way into the Kara-Khitai leadership and effectively taken it over. He married into the ruling family, he cultivated allies, he accumulated power gradually until he had enough of it to be the one actually making decisions. What he did with that power is where the story takes a turn that is both strategically revealing and morally instructive. Kuchlug was not a Muslim. He was a Nestorian Christian, or possibly a Buddhist depending on which source you consult. The historical record is not perfectly clear on his personal faith, but it is very clear on what he did. He launched a campaign of religious persecution against the Muslim-majority population of the Kara-Khitai Empire, forcing conversions, closing mosques, making life actively miserable for the people he was now supposedly ruling, in the name of a religious agenda that the vast majority of his subjects found alien and threatening. Now, the Mongols at this point in their history were not champions of religious tolerance as a moral principle they had arrived at through philosophical reflection. They were pragmatists of a very high order, and their attitude toward religion was essentially, worship whatever you like as long as you pay your taxes and do not cause problems. The steppe had always been home to multiple faiths simultaneously, and Genghis Khan's own court contained Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and followers of traditional shamanic practice, all operating alongside one another without anyone being particularly bothered about it. What Kuchlug had done from the Mongol perspective was less a moral outrage and more an enormous political gift. He had made himself hated by his own population. He had given Genghis Khan something to offer the people of the Kara-Khitai that would cost the Mongols almost nothing to deliver. In 1210, Genghis Khan sent Jebe westward with a relatively small force. Jebe, the arrowhead, the general who years earlier had shot Genghis Khan's horse out from under him during a battle against the Naimans, and who, when asked afterward who had fired the arrow, had stood up and said it was me, and had been made a general rather than executed for the honesty of the admission. That Jebe. one of the finest military minds in the Mongol Empire and a man whose instincts went well beyond simple cavalry tactics. Gebi sent word ahead of his army, deliberately, carefully, in advance of his arrival at each city. The message was simple and precisely calibrated. The Mongols would not interfere with local religious practice. Populations that surrendered peacefully would be protected. Whatever Kuchlug had been doing to them, that was over. After years of persecution, this message did not need much selling. Cities opened their gates, not grudgingly, not after token resistance, but with what the sources describe as genuine relief. People welcomed the Mongol force as liberators rather than conquerors, because relative to what they had been living under, that is what the Mongols were. Kuchlug fled. He ran, as he had run after the Battle of the Naimans, as fast as his horse could carry him in whatever direction seemed safest. Gebe's forces hunted him across the mountains of the Pamirs, and he was eventually caught and killed. The Karakitai Empire, with almost no actual fighting to speak of, became part of the Mongol world. This is one of the first really clear examples of a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the expansion of the empire, and that deserves to be understood as a genuine strategic doctrine rather than a happy accident. The Mongols were willing to do political messaging. They were willing to frame themselves deliberately and in advance as an alternative to oppressive or incompetent rulers, and to offer real and credible protection to populations that submitted voluntarily. The offer was genuine. As long as you came in peacefully, the protection was real, and the Mongols generally honoured it. The other side of the offer was also genuine and considerably less pleasant to contemplate. The pattern worked because both halves of it were credible. Everyone in the region knew what had happened to populations that chose resistance. The choice between the two outcomes was therefore not a difficult one for most people to make, once they believed the offer of protection was sincere. Kuchlug had handed Genghis Khan the mechanism to make it sincere, by being so comprehensively terrible to his own subjects that almost anything looked better. With the Karakitai absorbed, the Mongol Empire now shared a border with the Khwarezmian Empire, and here the story arrives at one of those hinge moments in history where a small number of decisions made by a small number of people produce consequences of almost incomprehensible scale. The Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, ruled one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world. His empire stretched from the Caspian Sea south through Persia and east through Afghanistan and into the territory the Mongols had just absorbed. It contained Samarkand and Bukhara and Urgench, cities that had been centres of Islamic civilization, scholarship, trade, and art for centuries. He had recently defeated a Karakitai army in a significant battle, and had used the victory to expand his territory and his sense of his own importance. He was, by the assessments of the sources that survive him, a man of considerable ego, limited wisdom, and a complicated relationship with the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, whom he regarded as a political rival rather than a religious authority to be deferred to. He was not especially loved by his own subjects. He had a reputation for impulsiveness, and he was about to make a decision so spectacularly, catastrophically wrong, that it would destroy everything he had built, kill an almost uncountable number of people, and alter the trajectory of Central Asian civilization for centuries. Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan to the Khwarezmian Empire. This was a significant gesture and was intended to be read as one. The caravan was large, hundreds of merchants, hundreds of camels, substantial goods. It was also carrying Muslim merchants operating under Mongol protection, which was itself a kind of statement. The Mongol Empire was interested in trade, in peaceful exchange, in the kind of relationship that enriched both sides. A diplomatic delegation accompanied it, establishing formal contact between the two powers. The caravan reached Otrar, a major city on the eastern edge of the Khwarezmian Empire. The governor of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, arrested the entire caravan. He sent to Muhammad II for instructions. Some sources say he suspected the merchants of being spies. Whether that suspicion was genuine or whether it was a pretext for seizing valuable goods, and the goods were certainly valuable, is not something the historical record resolves clearly. What it resolves clearly is what Muhammad II decided. He ordered the merchants executed and the goods confiscated, every single merchant killed. Genghis Khan's response initially was measured. He sent a second delegation, a formal diplomatic embassy this time, not a trade caravan. The message was direct: release the survivors, punish the governor of Otrar, make this right. It was, given what had happened, a remarkably restrained opening position, an offer of a way out that did not require total war. Muhammad II had the Muslim members of the embassy killed. He sent the Mongol members back with their beards shaved off. Shaving a man's beard on the steppe was not a minor indignity. It was a profound humiliation, a deliberate act of public degradation designed to communicate contempt in the clearest possible terms. Muhammad II was not merely declining to make amends, he was doubling down. He was in effect announcing that he was not afraid of whatever response his actions might provoke. He was wrong about that in a way that history does not often allow people to be wrong about things, and survive long enough to appreciate the full scale of the error. He did not survive long enough. There is a story. It may be true. It may be the kind of story that attaches itself to great moments after the fact because it feels right. That when word reached Genghis Khan of the massacre of his merchants and the humiliation of his envoys, he climbed alone to a nearby mountain, removed his hat and knelt in prayer for 3 days, asking heaven for guidance or for permission, or perhaps simply processing the magnitude of what he had decided he was going to do. Whether or not it happened exactly that way, the symbolism is accurate to the moment. What Genghis Khan was preparing was not a punitive raid. It was not a border campaign or a demonstration of displeasure designed to extract an apology in better terms. It was the full weight of everything he had spent 40 years building, directed at a single target, driven by a fury that went beyond strategic calculation into something considerably darker and more personal. Muhammad II had killed his merchants, had humiliated his ambassadors, had sent men back to his court with their beards removed, as if the Mongol Empire were something that could be insulted and dismissed. The Mongol Empire was about to introduce itself properly. The catastrophe, destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire. In 1219, Genghis Khan led the largest army he had ever assembled westward across the steppe. Estimates of the force vary enormously in the sources, and medieval chroniclers were not exactly reliable on numbers. Modern historians think the total Mongol force may have been somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 warriors. This was supplemented by Chinese siege engineers, their equipment, and forces from tributary peoples. It was an army assembled for a specific purpose. Not to raid and withdraw, not to accept tribute and move on, to destroy. Muhammad II's empire had a large population, considerable military resources, and cities that were among the most fortified in the world. He chose to defend in place, distributing his forces across his major cities, presumably calculating that the Mongols could not besiege all of them simultaneously and would eventually exhaust themselves or be worn down in the attempt. This was exactly the wrong strategy. Exactly wrong. Against a mobile force that was faster than any messenger Muhammad II could send between his garrisons, static defense meant that the Mongols could isolate each city in turn, while preventing relief forces from reaching them. Distributing forces across the empire meant that no single location had enough defenders to hold out indefinitely, and none could expect reinforcement. Genghis Khan divided his force. His sons Yoshi, Chagatai, and Ugedi led one force. Subutai, who we will talk about more extensively in the next chapter, led another, and Genghis Khan himself led the most audacious thrust of all. Samarkand and Bukhara were the jewels of the Khwarezmian Empire, great, ancient, wealthy cities. Bukhara had massive walls, a substantial garrison, and the confidence of a city that had stood for centuries. Genghis Khan appeared in front of Bukhara in 1220, having crossed what was then considered nearly impassable desert in winter, the Kizilkum, with his main force. The garrison defenders apparently took one look at the size of the force and the route from which it had appeared, from a direction they had considered impossible, and many fled. Genghis Khan is reported to have ridden into the main mosque of Bukhara and stood before the assembled population. He told them, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Whether he said exactly this or whether the story was assembled after the fact, it captures the experience of the people he was addressing. To them, the Mongols appeared with a totality and a speed that seemed almost supernatural. There was no build-up, no period of preparation, no warning that gave people time to psychologically adjust to the threat. The storm simply arrived. Bukhara was taken. Those who resisted were killed. The great library, the markets, the mosques. Fire took much of it. The survivors were driven before the army to the next city as human shields. Samarkand fell shortly after. A city of perhaps 500,000 people at its height. One of the greatest cities in the world at that moment. The garrison was massive. Sources vary. But it may have been 100,000 soldiers or more. It surrendered anyway because the Mongols had already demonstrated what resistance meant, and because Muhammad II's strategy of distributed defence had left the garrison without any realistic hope of relief. The Mongols killed the garrison soldiers. They generally killed people who had fought against them even after surrender, reserving mercy for those who submitted before fighting. The population was sorted. Artisans and skilled workers were taken for use by the empire. The wealthy paid ransom. Others were enslaved or driven ahead of the army. Those who could not be used and who were not ransomed often did not survive. Muhammad II himself was pursued west and then north, and then west again across his own crumbling empire by Subutai and Jebei with a strike force, hunted like a criminal across the kingdom he had once ruled. He died on a small island in the Caspian Sea, apparently of pleurisy or exhaustion, in 1221, still fleeing. His empire, which had been one of the most powerful in the world 2 years earlier, no longer existed. The destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire was an event of almost geological scale. The cities of Central Asia, Urgench, Merv, Nishapur, Herat, fell one after another. The Persian chronicler Juvaini, writing decades later, described Urgench as having been so thoroughly destroyed that a city of 100,000 might have been reduced to a handful of survivors. Modern historians debate the specific death tolls, which the medieval sources almost certainly inflate, but the consensus is that the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire killed millions of people, disrupted agricultural systems that took generations to recover, and fundamentally altered the demographic map of Central Asia. What was lost in cultural terms is staggering to contemplate. Libraries, schools of scholarship, architectural traditions, populations of artisans and craftspeople who had sustained those great Islamic cities for centuries, much of it gone or permanently diminished. It is worth asking honestly why. The massacre at Otrar explains the initial fury, but the scale of what followed exceeded punishment for a specific act. Part of it was strategic. Terror had always been a Mongol tool for reducing the cost of conquest. Cities that saw what happened to Bukhara and Samarkand were more likely to surrender without fighting. Part of it was the momentum of an army that had been assembled for total war and was in motion. And part of it may genuinely have been the personal rage of a man who had started his career with almost nothing, built something enormous through decades of hard work, and then had the first major peace offer of his foreign policy career, met with the murder of his merchants and the humiliation of his ambassadors. Whatever the combination of causes, the outcome was definitive. The Khwarezmian Empire was erased, and Genghis Khan turned his gaze in multiple directions simultaneously, because his generals were already ranging far beyond even the former Khwarezmian borders, Subutai and Jebei. The reconnaissance that changed the world, while Genghis Khan was systematically dismantling the Khwarezmian Empire city by city, and while his sons were reducing its great urban centres to rubble and ash, two of his finest generals were doing something that had no real precedent in military history. They were not fighting a campaign with a defined objective and a planned endpoint. They were exploring, aggressively, lethally, at the head of a Mongol army, but exploring nonetheless. Their names were Subutai and Jebei. And what they did between 1221 and 1223 is one of the most extraordinary military operations ever conducted by anyone, anywhere, in any era. I want you to actually sit with the scale of what they pulled off before we get into the details, because the details are easy to follow and the scale is easy to miss. They rode approximately 20,000 kilometers in roughly 3 years. Through terrain no Mongol army had ever crossed, among peoples who had never heard of the Mongols and had no conceptual framework for understanding what was riding toward them. They crossed the Caucasus Mountains in winter. They defeated a major regional kingdom. They manipulated 2 separate steppe confederations against each other with breathtaking cynicism. They appeared on the banks of the Dnieper River in what is now Ukraine, destroyed a combined army drawn from multiple Russian principalities, held a victory feast on top of the captured enemy commanders, and then vanished back into the east as completely as if they had never existed. And the whole thing was, from the beginning, an intelligence-gathering operation. It started with Muhammad II. The Khwarezmian Shah, whose catastrophic decision-making had brought the full weight of the Mongol Empire down on his civilization, had fled westward as the campaign unfolded. Subutai and Jebei had been sent to pursue him, which they did with the kind of relentless pressure that characterized everything the Mongols did when they wanted someone dead. Muhammad II was chased across his own crumbling empire from city to city, never able to stop long enough to organize resistance, until he reached the Caspian Sea and died on a small island, a broken man without an empire, sometime in 1221. Illness took him, or exhaustion, or simply the accumulated weight of watching everything he had built destroyed in a campaign that lasted less than 2 years? With the Shah dead, Subutai and Jibi had technically completed the assignment they had been given. Most commanders in that situation would have turned around and rejoined the main army. Subutai was not most commanders. He sent word to Genghis Khan. The message, paraphrased, was something like, "We are already here. We are already west of the Caucasus. There are lands beyond these mountains that we know almost nothing about, and we would like permission to keep going and find out what is there." Genghis Khan, who understood as well as any leader in history that information about potential enemies was a military asset of the First Order, said yes. What followed was the Great Ride West. Subutai and Jibi crossed the Caucasus Mountains in winter. The Kingdom of Georgia, a fairly powerful regional state that controlled the passes through the mountains, had calculated that the winter conditions would make those passes impassable to any military force and would therefore protect them from pursuit or attack during the cold months. This was a reasonable calculation based on the behaviour of every army Georgia had ever encountered. It did not account for men who had grown up on the Mongolian steppe, where winter was simply the season during which you raided your neighbours, because the frozen ground made movement easier. The Mongols were not slowed by the Caucasus winter in any meaningful way. The Georgians were defeated. The passes were crossed. Coming down out of the mountains on the northern side, Subutai and Jibi encountered two of the major powers of the northern Eurasian steppe. The Cuman Turks, a large and formidable confederation spread across the grasslands north of the Black Sea, and the Alans, a people occupying territory in the northern Caucasus region. Both groups were substantial military forces. Neither was equipped to deal with what had just come over the mountains. What happened next is such a perfectly executed piece of political manipulation that it is almost worth admiring in isolation from the violence it enabled. Subutai approached the Cumans with a message. "We are Turks, as you are Turks. We share blood and heritage. The Alans are not your people. Why are you fighting alongside them against us? Stand aside, let us deal with the Alans, and we will share the plunder with you and go in peace." The Cumans, apparently finding this argument persuasive, stood aside. The Alans were destroyed. Then Subutai turned on the Cumans. In fairness to the Cumans, they should probably have seen this coming. But in their partial defence, very few people in 1222 had yet developed a reliable intuition for how Mongol diplomatic promises worked in practice. The lesson, once learned, was not one people forgot. The Cumans fled westward in large numbers, pouring into Hungary and Poland and creating a refugee crisis among their neighbours that would have political consequences for years. Their arrival in Hungary, and the Hungarian king's decision to accept them, would later be used by the Mongols as a pretext for invasion. The pieces were being arranged on the board years before the game was played, and then Subutai and Jebe appeared on the banks of the Dnieper River, in the territory of the Rus principalities. The Russians had been getting reports from the Cumans. Something was coming. Something had destroyed the Alans, had defeated Georgia, had chased the Cuman Confederation off the steppe. The reports were alarming but also confusing, because the people giving them had no real framework for describing what they had encountered. The Russian princes knew that something dangerous was approaching from the east. They did not know what it was, where it had come from, or what it wanted. A coalition assembled. Several Russian princes coordinated their forces with a substantial Cuman contingent, and marched to meet the threat on the Kalka River in 1223. This was, by the standards of the region and the period, a serious military force. The princes who participated represented some of the major power centres of the Rus world. The combined army was not negligible. It did not matter. The Battle of the Kalka River was the feigned retreat used at a level of refinement that makes it look almost effortless in retrospect. Subutai pulled his forces back before the advancing Russian and Cuman army, slowly enough to maintain contact, fast enough to keep the pursuit moving forward. The Russians and Cumans, interpreting this as the Mongols breaking under pressure, pressed forward with increasing confidence. The trap closed. The encirclement was complete before the pursuing force fully understood what was happening, and once encircled, the outcome was the outcome it always was. The combined army was shattered, not simply defeated, destroyed as a coherent fighting force. Several Russian princes were captured alive, which presented a small protocol question about what to do with them. The Mongol solution was characteristically specific. The princes were placed on the ground, wooden boards were laid over them, and the Mongol commanders held their victory feast on top of the boards, celebrating while the weight of the feasting above slowly crushed the men beneath. No blood was spilled. By the Mongol reading of the appropriate treatment of noble captives, this constituted a kind of honor. By any other reading, it was a statement. Russian chronicles written in the years after the battle describe it with a quality of bewildered horror that is distinct from ordinary accounts of military defeat. The writers do not know how to categorize what happened. They do not know where these people came from. They do not know what they wanted. They do not know why they left afterward. The language in the sources reaches for apocalyptic framing because the ordinary vocabulary of warfare and politics does not quite fit. Who are they? Nobody knows where they came from. They appeared, killed everyone, and went away. God knows where they came from and God knows where they went. They went back to report. That is the thing that tends to get lost in the drama of the Kalka River battle. The battle was not the point. The battle was a data collection exercise that happened to involve the complete destruction of a combined Russian and Cuman army. The point was the information, the geography of the Western Steppe, the layout of the Russian principalities, their political relationships with one another, their military capabilities and their limitations. The wealth of the lands to the west, the Hungarian plains with their vast grasslands that could support Mongol horses as well as any steppe, the political fragmentation of the kingdoms beyond, the quality of the armies that would have to be faced if someone wanted to take all of this. Subutai brought all of that back east with him. The reconnaissance was complete, the report was delivered, and the information would sit in the Mongol Empire's institutional memory for 17 years before Subutai got the chance to use it. Jebe did not make it back. He died on the return journey, probably from illness or from wounds sustained during the campaign, though the sources are not specific. He was one of the finest military minds the Mongol Empire produced, a general whose combination of tactical brilliance and personal courage had been proven across campaigns spanning more than a decade. The Empire lost something real when he died, and it is one of the small ironies of his story that he survived everything the steppe and the Khwarezmian campaign and the Caucasus and the Kalka River threw at him, and then died on the way home. Subutai lived. Subutai, who had been a commander since before the Great Kurultai of 1206, who had been fighting at the highest level of Mongol warfare for close to 2 decades, who had just ridden 20,000 kilometers and defeated armies across half a continent, came home with his intelligence assessment and waited. He was perhaps in his 40s. He had already done more than most military careers contain. He was not finished, not remotely. The Western campaign that the reconnaissance had been designed to prepare for was still coming. The Russian princes who had assembled on the Kalka River had not understood what they were facing. Europe had not understood what had just probed its eastern borders and gone quietly home again. 17 years later, Subutai would return, and this time he would not be gathering information. He would be using it. The death of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan returned east from the Khwarezmian campaign to find unfinished business waiting for him. The Western Shia, the Tangut kingdom, the first people he had campaigned against back in 1205, had not behaved as a tributary state should. During the Great Western Campaign, when Genghis Khan had requested military support from the Western Shia, as was their obligation as a subject state, the Tangut leadership had refused. The refusal was reportedly accompanied by an insult. If you need help, they essentially told him, you might not be as powerful as you think. You should find yourself better allies. These were not wise words to say to Genghis Khan. In 1226 he launched his final campaign, the destruction of the Western Shia. He was by now in his 60s by his own reckoning, and apparently still personally leading armies in the field. The campaign proceeded exactly as one would expect, given everything we have discussed. The Western Shia's military was destroyed in the field, their cities were taken, their capital was besieged, and then, sometime in the summer of 1227, Genghis Khan died. The causes of his death are not recorded definitively. The secret history, the primary Mongol source, does not dwell on it. Chinese sources offer various suggestions. Illness, a hunting accident, injuries sustained in a fall from a horse during an earlier campaign, internal injuries that worsened over time. A later Tibetan tradition claims he was wounded by the last Tangut queen, who had been brought to his tent, and that she wounded him before being killed. This story has the flavour of legend. The great conqueror brought low by a woman he'd just conquered, and historians treat it with appropriate skepticism. What we know is that he died during or shortly after the Western Shia campaign. His body was returned to Mongolia, according to later accounts, by a funeral escort that killed everyone they encountered on the road, to prevent the route and the burial location from becoming known. He was buried in an unmarked grave, the location of which has never been definitively found. He had instructed that his burial place remain hidden, and his instructions have been obeyed across 8 centuries. The Western Xia, in a kind of grim posthumous tribute, was destroyed anyway. His commanders completed the destruction he had ordered, and the Tangut state ceased to exist. What did Genghis Khan leave behind? In material terms, an empire that already stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the Caspian Sea. A territory larger than the Roman Empire at its height. In human terms, the largest cavalry-based military force in the world, restructured and trained to a standard of discipline that had no parallel on the steppe. In institutional terms, a framework of governance that, while primitive compared to what would develop under his successors, was beginning to incorporate administrative techniques from every civilization the Mongols had encountered, and in personal terms, a legacy so large and so complex that it has never been satisfactorily resolved. He was a man who had been abandoned in childhood and built the largest empire the world had ever seen from nothing. He was a man who rewarded loyalty with extraordinary generosity and punished betrayal with absolute finality. He was a man responsible for the deaths of millions of people. The estimates range from 10 million to 40 million, and none of them are precise. And who was also personally kind to individuals who had earned his trust, regardless of their ethnic or religious background. He is buried somewhere in Mongolia under unmarked grass. The sky above that grass, wherever it is enormous and absolutely full of stars, and the world he left behind was irreversibly different from the one into which he had been born. Ogedei Khan and the expansion continues. Genghis Khan had arranged his succession before his death, at least in broad terms. In the Mongol system, the Great Khan was elected by a kurultai of the major family members and commanders. This was the tradition, and it was not purely ceremonial. There was genuine deliberation and politics involved. Genghis Khan had designated his third son Ogedei as his preferred successor. This was partly because Ogedei had shown considerable political and military competence, and partly because of the family dynamics. His eldest son Yochi, whose parentage had always carried the shadow of Borte's kidnapping, had died in 1227, just months before Genghis Khan himself. Whether from illness or under more suspicious circumstances is not definitively known. His second son Chagatai was fierce and capable, but also rigid and difficult to work with. Tolui, the youngest, was highly capable militarily, and was the guardian of the Mongol homeland by tradition, but was perhaps too focused on military matters to be the political centre the empire needed. Ogedei was elected Great Khan in 1229 at a kurultai, and immediately set about demonstrating that he had inherited more than a title. He had inherited his father's ambitions and a significant part of his strategic vision. The Jin Dynasty of northern China was still not fully conquered. This was the unfinished work that Ogedei addressed first and most decisively. Working with Tolui's forces and coordinating a massive campaign, the Mongols finally broke the Jin Dynasty's remaining resistance in 1234. The last Jin emperor committed suicide rather than be captured. Northern China, meaning the territory north of the Huai River, was Mongol territory. The wealth of the Jin Empire was staggering. The Mongol commanders initially wanted to turn the farmland into pasture for horses. One of Genghis Khan's Chinese advisors, Yelu Chukai, made a famous argument against this. The conquered territories were worth more as functioning agricultural regions producing tax revenue than as pasture. This is often presented as a turning point, the moment when the Mongols began transitioning from pure conquerors to actual administrators. It is probably somewhat exaggerated as a single moment, but the argument itself is historically significant. The Mongols could be reasoned with, and the right argument at the right time could shift their approach. Ogedei was, by personal temperament, a more amiable man than his father. He was famously generous, distributing wealth to followers and suppliants with an open-handed extravagance that his treasury officials sometimes found alarming. He was a heavy drinker, which his brother Chagatai disapproved of loudly and publicly, to the point of appointing someone to monitor Ogedei's alcohol intake. Ogedei's response was to simply drink every other day and drink more on the days he was allowed. Sibling dynamics do not change much across time and culture. But Ogedei was also a genuine builder. He oversaw the construction of Karakorum, the capital city of the Mongol Empire on the Mongolian steppe. Karakorum was not a grand city by the standards of the civilizations the Mongols had conquered. A later Franciscan friar who visited it observed that Paris had more houses than Karakorum had buildings, but it was a centre of administration, a point where the revenues of the empire converged and were redistributed, and symbolically it demonstrated that the Mongols were not just conquerors, but empire builders. It had walls, it had markets where merchants from across the world came to trade, it had places of worship for multiple religions, a Muslim quarter, Christian churches, Buddhist temples. The Mongol court at Karakorum was genuinely cosmopolitan, in the odd way that an empire built on conquest can become a hub of exchange. Under Ogedei, the Mongol administrative system also developed the yam, the postal relay system. Horses were stationed at intervals across the empire, allowing messages to travel from one end to the other with extraordinary speed. An imperial messenger could cover enormous distances in days that would take ordinary travellers weeks or months. This system was not Ogedei's invention alone. It built on steppe traditions of horse relay. But under his reign it became systematized and formalized across the full extent of the empire, and Ogedei, with his father's work in the east largely complete, turned the empire's attention westward. Because Subutai was waiting with a plan. The Western campaigns, into Europe. The campaign that Subutai had been planning since his return from the Great Reconnaissance of 1223 was finally launched in 1235, when the Kurultai authorized a full Western campaign. Batu Khan, Jochi's son and therefore Genghis Khan's grandson, was designated the nominal commander. Subutai was the actual military mind. The force assembled was substantial, drawing from across the empire, experienced commanders, the best cavalry forces the Mongols could field, and years of accumulated intelligence about the western steppe and the kingdoms that lay beyond it. Their first target was the Volga Bulgars, a Muslim kingdom in the upper Volga region that had actually managed to defeat a small Mongol raiding force in 1223. The Bulgars must have felt some confidence, perhaps, that they had turned back the Mongols before. In 1236, the Mongols arrived in considerably larger numbers and with Subutai in command. The Volga-Bulgar state was destroyed, their cities were burned, their population scattered, then the Russian principalities. In 1237, the Mongol army crossed the frozen Volga River and entered northeastern Russia during winter. The Russian princes had known, in the abstract, that the people who had destroyed them on the Kalka River might return. They had not prepared in any coordinated way. The Russian principalities were politically fragmented, with rival princes more concerned with their own local competitions than with coordinating a collective defence against an external threat. Ryazan was the first to fall. The prince sent to his neighbours for help. No help came. Ryazan was besieged, taken and destroyed in 6 days. Vladimir and Suzdal fell. Moscow, then a minor settlement of little significance, was burned. City after city across northeastern Russia was taken, some with days, some within hours. The Mongols moved across the frozen rivers, using them as highways, covering distances with speed that made organised resistance impossible. Novgorod, the great northern trading city, was saved not by its walls or its army but by geography. Spring arrived and the frozen rivers began to thaw. The Mongols, whose horses were ill-suited to the boggy, forested terrain that surrounded Novgorod, turned south rather than risk losing horses in the thaw. In 1240, the Mongols returned for the second phase. Kiev, at this point still one of the most important cities in the Slavic world, the great city of the Rus, ancient and wealthy and surrounded by formidable walls, was approached by a force whose size apparently caused the scouts to compare it to a cloud of locusts blotting out the sun. The din of the Mongol camp, one account says, was so loud that conversation inside the city walls was impossible. Kiev fell after a siege. The great churches were ransacked. The population suffered catastrophically. The city that had been the political heart of the Rus world was reduced to rubble, and a handful of survivors. From Kiev, the Mongol army split into 2 main prongs and drove into Central Europe. The northern prong, commanded by Baidar and Orda with Subutai's guidance, moved through Poland. The Poles assembled a force to meet them at Lenica in 1241, a combined army of Polish knights, Teutonic knights, and other forces that was not negligible by European standards. It was destroyed. The European knights, who had never encountered coordinated Mongol tactics, were pulled forward by feigned retreat, encircled and annihilated. The ears of the dead were reportedly collected in 9 sacks. Duke Henry II of Silesia, who commanded the Polish force, was killed and decapitated. The southern prong, commanded by Batu and directly overseen by Subutai, drove into Hungary. King Belafor of Hungary had received the Cumans, the refugees who had fled the Mongols years earlier, and this was taken by some as preparation for war. The Mongols had sent ambassadors demanding submission, and when Bela executed them, the invasion became inevitable. The Battle of Mohi in 1241 was the decisive confrontation. Bela Fortub had assembled one of the largest armies in Hungarian history. The Mongols, by now deeply expert at making medieval armies do exactly what they wanted them to do, created the illusion of a defensible situation, allowed the Hungarian army to camp in a position they believed was secure, and then launched a night attack on the bridge they were defending on one side, while a flanking force crossed the river upstream. The Hungarian army was encircled, and then, and this is the part that Subutai was particularly known for, the encirclement was deliberately left with a gap, an apparent escape route. Armies that see an escape take it. Armies in a closed encirclement fight to the death or surrender. Armies running for a gap run in a column, and a column running for its life along a single escape route, harassed by cavalry from all sides, loses cohesion and cannot fight back effectively. The Hungarian army was destroyed. Belafor himself barely escaped. Subutai's forces ranged across Hungary, burning, looting, and demonstrating that the kingdom had no remaining effective resistance. Mongol scouts reached the Adriatic coast, peered at the sea, and apparently satisfied their curiosity about what lay in that direction. Europe was, and this is not an exaggeration, on the edge of being overrun. Western Europe in 1241 had no army remotely capable of stopping the force that had just destroyed the Polish and Hungarian kingdom simultaneously. The Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor were currently in the middle of a bitter political conflict with each other. France, England, and other Western kingdoms were not in a position to coordinate a defence that might have had any realistic chance of success. And then, in late 1241, Ögedei Khan died. The news reached the Mongol commanders in Hungary in early 1242. By the terms of Mongol custom, the great commanders had to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai that would elect the new great Khan. Batu, who had his own political interests in the succession, was reportedly eager to head east anyway. Subutai, who by some accounts was absolutely not finished with Europe and had been planning an advance into the Western kingdoms, had to accept the reality of the political situation. The Mongols withdrew from Hungary, permanently. The withdrawal was not caused by military failure. They had not been defeated. They had not hit the limit of their military capacity. They left because the political centre of their empire required their attention, and once withdrawn, the momentum was gone. The Western campaign was never resumed at the same scale. Was it a close call for Europe? Almost certainly. Would the Mongols have conquered the Western kingdoms? That is harder to say. The terrain and the climate of Western Europe were different from the Eastern steppe. Forests and hills limited cavalry effectiveness. Cities were more numerous and harder to isolate, but they had already demonstrated extraordinary adaptability, and Subutai's record of never losing a major engagement makes the question genuinely open. What we know is that they stopped, and Europe, largely by luck and the death of a great Khan in the east, was spared. The Mongols and China, Kublai Khan's obsession. The conquest of southern China was the longest and most difficult military campaign in Mongol history, and it came to define the career of the most famous Mongol ruler after Genghis Khan himself, Kublai Khan. The southern Song dynasty had been watching the Mongols devour northern China and the Khwarezmian Empire with what one imagines was extreme anxiety. They had, in a move of somewhat breathtaking short-sightedness, actually allied with the Mongols to help finish off the Jin dynasty, their old enemy, in 1234. This is the historical equivalent of asking a wolf to help you deal with a fox, and it worked about as well as you might expect. After the Jin fell, the Song realized they were now sharing a border with the Mongol Empire. Relations deteriorated quickly. The Mongols demanded tribute and submission. The Song, for various reasons, pride, political dynamics, a calculation that the Yangtze River and the dense southern landscape might protect them, refused. The southern landscape was the key variable. The Mongol advantage was cavalry, fast, mobile, hard-hitting, able to live off the land and cover enormous distances. Northern China had steppes and plains where this worked beautifully. Southern China had the Yangtze River, its network of tributaries, lakes, marshes, paddy fields, hills, and a climate of subtropical humidity. Horses did not function well in this landscape. Disease took them. The terrain channeled armies into narrow frontiers that could be defended. The Song had a massive population, enormous resources, and the natural advantages of geography. They also had gunpowder weapons more developed than anything the Mongols had yet encountered. Firebombs, primitive fire lances, incendiary projectiles that could set ships ablaze. And the Song had a navy. On the Yangtze and its tributaries, the Song could contest Mongol advances in a way that was simply not possible on open ground. The campaign went through several phases under different commanders over several decades. It was not a smooth arc of Mongol dominance. There were significant setbacks. Fortified cities held for years at a time. Xiangyang, a strategic fortress city on the Han River, resisted Mongol siege for more than 5 years. From 1267 to 1273, in one of the longest sieges in medieval history, the Mongols eventually brought in Persian engineers with counterweight trebuchets of a design not previously seen in China, and the psychological impact of this new technology contributed to the city's eventual fall. Kublai Khan, who became Great Khan in 1260, was the driving force of the southern campaign. He was in many ways a different kind of Mongol leader. He had grown up in an empire already in existence, not in the founding violence of Genghis Khan's rise. He was educated, interested in Chinese culture and governance, and increasingly oriented towards settled civilization rather than the steppe. He spoke Chinese, consulted Confucian scholars, and thought about governance in Chinese administrative terms. This made him controversial within the Mongol aristocracy. His brother Arik Bok challenged him for the title of Great Khan, and there was genuine civil war within the empire from 1260 to 1264. Kublai won, but the conflict revealed the deep tension between the Mongol steppe tradition and the settled empire that the dynasty was becoming. Arik Bok had the traditional Kurultai majority. Kublai had the military resources and the wealth of China. In the end, resources won. After the fall of Xiangyang, the Song resistance began to collapse. The Mongol army, supplemented now by naval forces that the empire had built and acquired, pushed down the Yangtze. Song cities fell in succession. The Song court fled south and then to sea, conducting a kind of maritime government aboard ships for the last years of the dynasty. The final battle, Yamen in 1279, was a naval engagement off the coast of modern Guangdong province. The last Song fleet carrying the child emperor Zhaobing was surrounded. The Song prime minister, Lu Xiufu, rather than allow the emperor to be captured, carried the 7-year-old boy into the sea. Both drowned. The southern Song dynasty ended in the water. China was, for the first time since the Han dynasty 1,000 years earlier, unified under a single ruler. That ruler was Kublai Khan. In 1271, he had already declared the founding of the Yuan Dynasty, positioning himself formally as a Chinese emperor rather than simply a Mongol Khan who happened to control China. He moved the imperial capital from Karakoram to Dadu, modern Beijing, and built a court that was recognizably Chinese in its architecture and administration, while retaining Mongol characteristics in its military and social hierarchy. Into this world arrived Marco Polo, probably around 1275, having travelled overland from Venice with his father and uncle. He would serve at the Yuan court for 17 years, and his account, for all its embellishments and inaccuracies, remains one of the most important windows into the Mongol Empire at its height. His descriptions of Kublai Khan's court, the vast palace, the ordered gardens, the diversity of peoples in attendance, the scale of administration, paint a picture of an empire that had, at least partially, transformed from a force of conquest into a force of governance. Whether Kublai Khan had truly become a Chinese emperor or was a Mongol ruler who had adopted Chinese trappings remained a live question for his subjects, and remains one for historians. The truth was probably somewhere in between, which was itself a kind of answer. The Ilkhanate, Mongols in the Islamic world. To understand what the Mongols did in the Islamic world, you have to understand what the Islamic world was in the middle of the 13th century. The Abbasid Caliphate, based in Baghdad, was the symbolic heart of Sunni Islam. The Caliph was not just a political ruler. The political reality of the Caliphate had been complicated for centuries, with actual power often held by sultans or emirs, while the Caliph functioned as a religious figurehead. But the symbolic weight of that role was enormous. The Caliph was the successor to the Prophet Muhammad in the religious sense, the head of the Muslim community, the legitimizing authority for Muslim rulers across the world. The idea that the Caliphate could simply end, that it could be extinguished by external force, was almost literally unimaginable to most Muslims. It also turned out not to be unimaginable to the Mongols, who imagined and then executed it. Hulagu Khan, Kublai's brother and the grandson of Genghis Khan, was designated to lead the southwestern campaigns. He set out from Mongolia in 1253, with a force that by some accounts included 1 in 10 of all able-bodied Mongol men, an extraordinary commitment of resources. His first targets were the Ismaili assassins, the mountain fortress dwelling sect that had spread terror through the Islamic world for over a century. They fell, somewhat anticlimactically, between 1256 and 1257. Their famous mountain fortresses, including Alamut, were taken and their Grand Master eventually executed. The assassins ceased to be a major political force. Then Hulagu turned to Baghdad. The Caliph al-Mustasim had been given the opportunity to submit. He had not taken it, for a combination of reasons, perhaps underestimating the threat, perhaps calculating that the sanctity of the caliphate would give him protection, perhaps relying on advice from court factions that proved disastrously wrong. He also reportedly insulted the Mongol messengers, which at this point in history should be filed under categories of reliably bad ideas. In 1258, the Mongol army arrived outside Baghdad. The caliph's forces made a brief attempt at resistance and were destroyed in the field. The city was besieged. After roughly 2 weeks, Baghdad surrendered. What followed has been described in Islamic historical memory as one of the greatest catastrophes in the history of the civilization. Baghdad was systematically looted and then set on fire. The population suffered mass killing on a scale that medieval sources, which are prone to exaggeration, still struggle to convey even in inflated numbers. The caliph himself was killed. The method varies by source, with the Mongol tradition of not spilling noble blood suggesting he was rolled in carpets and trampled or suffocated, though some sources describe other ends. The destruction of Baghdad included the destruction of the House of Wisdom, the great library and intellectual centre that had been the heart of Islamic scholarship for centuries, holding irreplaceable texts of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and literature. The accounts of books thrown into the Tigris River until the water ran black with ink may be exaggerated, but they capture the lived reality of a cultural catastrophe. Centuries of accumulated knowledge were lost or scattered, and the caliphate was over. The institution that had defined political Islam since 632 was gone. Never, at least not as an actual political and religious power, restored. A shadow caliphate continued in Cairo under Mamluk patronage, but it was a continuation in name only. From Baghdad, Hulagu pushed northwest. Syria fell, Damascus fell, Aleppo fell. The Mongol forces were now on the edge of Egypt, and the Sultanate of Egypt, the Mamluks, was the last major Muslim power standing in the region. Here, history pivoted. In 1260, at a place called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, in what is now northern Israel, the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz and his brilliant general Baybars met the Mongol force in open battle. The Mongols were not at full strength. Hulagu had withdrawn most of his army eastward after the death of Mongol Khan to be involved in the succession crisis, leaving a garrison force under a general named Kitbuka. The Mamluks knew this. They timed their counterattack deliberately. The Mamluks lured the Mongols into a trap, feigning retreat and then encircling them. Using the same basic tactic the Mongols had used against everyone else for 50 years, turned back on its inventors. Kitbuka was killed. The Mongol force was destroyed. The Mongols attempted several more invasions of Egypt over the following decades. All of them failed. Ain Jalut was the first major defeat the Mongols had suffered in open battle. It stopped the expansion in the southwest. It saved Egypt, and possibly North Africa and the Western Islamic world, from the destruction that had already consumed the East, and it added the Mamluks to the short list of powers that could credibly claim to have stopped the Mongols. Hulagu's descendants continued to rule as the Ilkhanate across Persia and the former Khwarezmian lands, and here a remarkable thing happened. The Mongols who had destroyed the Islamic world's greatest cities gradually converted to Islam. By the early 14th century, most of the Ilkhanate's ruling class had adopted the faith of the people they had conquered. The destroyers of the caliphate became Muslim rulers. History does not follow neat moral arcs, but it does occasionally produce poetic ironies of this scale. The Golden Horde, Mongols on the Russian steppe. While all of this was unfolding in China, in the Islamic world, and in the failed invasion of Europe, the Western steppe, the vast grasslands between Mongolia and the borders of Central Europe, became the domain of what is known as the Golden Horde. Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan through Yochi, established his headquarters on the lower Volga River after the Western campaigns wound down. The territory he ruled, known in Russian sources as the Ulus of Yochi, and in Western sources as the Golden Horde, the name coming from the golden colour of Batu's grand tent, covered an enormous swath of the Eurasian steppe from the western edge of Siberia, through the Kazakh steppe, and across the former Cuman territories to the borders of Hungary and Poland. The Golden Horde's relationship with the Russian principalities was one of the defining political facts of the next 2 centuries in Russian history. After the destruction of 1237 and 1240, the Russian princes were reduced to tributaries. They paid tribute to the Horde, and they had to travel to Sarai, the Golden Horde capital on the Lower Volga, to receive the Yarlik, the patent, the permission, that allowed them to rule their own principalities. This was a specific and deeply humiliating arrangement. Russian princes had to kneel before the Khan, bring gifts, demonstrate submission, and receive their authority to rule their own people from a foreign overlord. Those who failed to do this, or who did it poorly, could be deposed. Those who did it well, who played the politics of the Horde's court effectively, who brought the right gifts and showed the right degree of submission, could thrive, at least relatively speaking. The princes of Muscovy, a small principality that would eventually give rise to Russia as we know it, were particularly effective at navigating Horde politics. The early Muscovite princes were, by any honest assessment, extremely talented collaborators. They collected taxes for the Horde, demonstrated loyalty, and used their privileged position as the Horde's preferred intermediaries to accumulate power at the expense of rival Russian princes. Later Russian nationalist historiography would find this uncomfortable, but it was the reality of how the Muscovite principality rose to prominence. The Mongol period, known in Russian history as the Tatar-Mongol yoke, lasted in various forms until 1480, when Ivan III of Muscovy famously refused to pay tribute, and nothing terrible happened as a result, because the Golden Horde had by then declined too far to enforce it. The effects of 2 centuries of Mongol domination on Russia are debated vigorously by historians. Some argue that the Mongol period fundamentally shaped Russian political culture. The centralization of authority, the relationship between ruler and subject, even specific administrative practices, in lasting ways. Others argue that these continuities are overstated, and that Russian political development followed its own internal logic. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and the debate is itself an interesting one about how we understand cultural transmission over long periods. What is less debated is the demographic and material damage. The destruction of the 1330s was real and severe. Populations declined, cities were burned, agricultural patterns were disrupted. It took generations for the affected regions to recover. The Golden Horde itself was internally dynamic. It had its own succession crises, its own court politics, its own relationships with neighbouring powers. It traded with the Genoese merchants who established colonies on the Black Sea coast, creating a commercial network that made Sarai one of the largest cities in Europe by the 14th century. The Horde converted to Islam under Khan Uzbek in the early 14th century, which added a religious dimension to its relationship with the Orthodox Christian Russian principalities. And eventually, like all the other pieces of the Mongol Empire, it fractured and declined, leaving behind traces in the populations, the languages, and the political geography of the Eurasian steppe that are still visible today. The fracturing of the empire, civil war and succession. From the beginning, the Mongol Empire carried within it the seeds of its own division. Not because it was badly built, in many ways it was built with extraordinary sophistication for its time, but because of a fundamental tension between the steppe tradition of collective family ownership of conquered territory and the practical reality of governing an empire that covered much of the known world. On the steppe, the tradition was that a leader's territory and wealth were shared among his male descendants, not passed to one son but distributed. Every son of Genghis Khan received a share. Every grandson received a share. The empire was, in theory, a collective possession of the Chinggisid family, the descendants of Genghis Khan, with the Great Khan as the supreme authority over a unified whole. In practice, the Ulus, the territorial allocations astern of each branch of the family, became increasingly independent entities. Yoshi's descendants ruled the Golden Horde. Chagatai's descendants ruled Central Asia. Hulagu's descendants became the Ilkhanate, and the core of the empire, Mongolia and China, was eventually centered on Kublai Khan. The question of who was the Great Khan, the supreme authority over all of these, became increasingly contentious as the empire grew. Genghis Khan's immediate successors had managed to hold the structure together through a combination of political skill and military dominance, but the further the empire got from its founding generation, the harder this became. The death of Ogadei in 1241 set off the first major succession crisis. His widow Torrigan acted as regent for 5 years while the Kurultai debated. She was a politically sharp woman. She built her own coalition, cultivated allies and outmaneuvered rivals, and eventually secured the election of her son Guyuk as Great Khan in 1246. Guyuk was not beloved. He had quarrelled with Batu Khan during the Western campaigns with such vehemence that the two men almost came to open war on the steppe. He reigned for less than 2 years before dying in 1248, apparently on his way to confront Batu with military force. The next election, in 1251, went to Monkey, a grandson of Genghis Khan through Tolui. Monkey was a capable ruler who managed to hold the empire together and launched the simultaneous campaigns that sent Hulagu southwest into the Islamic world and pressed the Southern Song campaign in China. He died on campaign against the Song in 1259, and his death set off the most serious fracture yet. Kublai, as we have discussed, won the civil war against Uruk-Boku, but his victory came with a cost. The Western Khanates, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia and the Golden Horde, refused to recognize Kublai as the legitimate Great Khan. From their perspective, the election of Kublai had been irregular, and his increasingly Chinese orientation made him suspect as a true Mongol ruler. They began to operate as effectively independent states, cooperating with Kublai when interests aligned and opposing him when they did not. By the latter part of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire had functionally become 4 separate khanates. The Yuan Dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia and Iraq, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the Western Steppe. They still shared the Chinggisid identity and occasionally coordinated, but they also fought wars against each other, which, given that they were each enormous military powers in their own right, produced conflicts of considerable destructiveness. The Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde were in a nearly constant state of war through the late 13th and early 14th centuries, fighting over the Caucasus region with a persistence that weakened both. The Chagatai Khanate fragmented between eastern and western factions. The Yuan Dynasty under Kublai launched expensive and ultimately unsuccessful overseas campaigns that drained resources and morale. The great empire was pulling apart, not all at once, not dramatically in a single moment, but steadily, as the political and cultural gravity of the very different regions the empire had conquered pulled the successor states in different directions. Kublai Khan's failures: Japan, Vietnam, Java. Kublai Khan was, by the standards of his time and by the standards of the empire, a genuinely successful ruler of China. The Yuan dynasty's administration functioned. The population recovered from the devastation of conquest. Trade flourished along the routes the Mongol Empire had secured. The famous Silk Road, under Mongol protection, allowed Marco Polo and people like him to travel overland from Europe to China in relative safety. Relative being doing a lot of work in that sentence, but the concept was real. But Kublai Khan also had a fatal weakness common to rulers of great power. He was susceptible to the idea that his power was unlimited, that the same forces that had worked in the steppe and in northern China and eventually in southern China would work everywhere. He launched several overseas campaigns that demonstrated in painful and expensive ways exactly where the limits of the Mongol military model lay. Japan was the most dramatic failure. In 1274, Kublai launched the first invasion of Japan with a force of perhaps 25,000 soldiers carried in 900 ships. The Japanese fought back with desperate courage, and the Mongols, who were not natural sailors and whose tactics depended on the mobile coordination that shipboard landing makes almost impossible, took heavy casualties, and then a typhoon arrived. The fleet was badly damaged, and the invasion force withdrew. Kublai tried again in 1281 with a far larger force, perhaps 140,000 soldiers in hundreds of ships, one of the largest naval invasions before the 20th century. The Japanese resistance was fierce. The landing beachheads were contested inch by inch, and then another typhoon struck. The fleet was destroyed. The invasion force was stranded without resupply and was destroyed piecemeal. The Japanese called the typhoons kamikaze, divine winds, and the religious interpretation was understandable. Something had to explain the salvation of their islands from the most powerful empire in the world. Vietnam, or more precisely the kingdom of Dai Viet and the Cham kingdom, proved another humiliation. The Mongols invaded 3 times, in 1257, 1285, and 1287. Each time, the Vietnamese strategy was the same and devastatingly effective. Do not stand and fight the Mongol cavalry in open field. Retreat into the jungle and the delta. Let disease and heat and the impossibility of supplying a large army in difficult terrain exhaust the invaders. Strike the supply lines with guerrilla tactics. Then, when the invaders are weak and hungry and ill, hit them going home. The Vietnamese general Tran Hung Dao, who organized the third and most comprehensive resistance, is still celebrated as one of the great military commanders in Vietnamese history. His campaign against the Mongol invasion of 1287 ended with a Vietnamese naval ambush at the Bac Dang River, where the tide was used to trap the Mongol fleet among hidden stakes driven into the riverbed. It was a decisive defeat that mirrors, in some respects, the same kind of tactical intelligence that the Mongols themselves had used against others. Tran Hung Dao understood the Mongols well enough to beat them with their own principles. Java, in what is now Indonesia, was another catastrophe. A Mongol expedition in 1293 landed, found itself drawn into local political conflicts it did not understand, helped one Javanese faction defeat another, and then was attacked by the faction it had just helped, who apparently decided this was an opportune moment to take revenge for certain earlier indignities. The Mongol force extracted itself and returned to China. Kublai Khan apparently was not pleased. These failures matter not just as entertaining reversals for an empire that seemed otherwise unstoppable. They reveal something important about the limits of Mongol power. The Mongol military model was brilliantly adapted to the open steppe and the flat agricultural plains of northern China and Central Asia. It was harder to adapt to jungle warfare, to naval operations, to the specific political geography of Southeast Asian kingdoms, or to islands that typhoons could defend better than any army. When the Mongols could not project cavalry power effectively, when the terrain and climate worked against them, when they were fighting in unfamiliar political context, they lost, and those losses were expensive enough to weaken the empire's financial position and its military reputation simultaneously. The plague, the Black Death and the Mongol connection. Here is a sentence that requires sitting with. The same empire that connected the world also killed it. Not intentionally, not as a military strategy, but as a consequence of something that no one in the 13th or 14th century understood or could have understood. The Mongol Empire, by creating a network of trade routes, postal roads, and regular human movement across Eurasia, also created the most efficient disease transmission network the medieval world had ever seen. And the disease that travelled along it, beginning in the 1340s, was Yersinia pestis, the Black Death. The plague almost certainly originated in Central Asia, the region that was the heartland of the Mongol Empire and the intersection point of its trade routes. Rodent populations, particularly marmots on the steppe, were the natural reservoir for the bacteria. The disruption of ecosystems caused by decades of Mongol campaigning, the movement of massive armies across the steppe, the concentration of populations in new trading centres, all of these created conditions that allowed the bacteria to cross from its animal reservoir into human populations with catastrophic consequences. The Mongol yam, the postal relay system, the very thing that made the empire function, became a transmission highway. Merchants, soldiers, and officials moved along the roads with their goods and, unknowingly, with fleas and rats carrying the plague. From Central Asia it moved in multiple directions simultaneously. East into China, where epidemics that may have been the plague devastated populations in the 1330s and 40s. West along the Silk Road. South through the Islamic world. And then through the Genoese traders who maintained colonies on the Black Sea coast, in cities like Kaffa, which was besieged by the Golden Horde in 1346, during which siege the Mongol forces allegedly catapulted plague-infected corpses into the city, into the Mediterranean, and then into Europe. The Black Death reached Sicily in 1347. By 1353 it had killed, by modern estimates, between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. Probably between 75 million and 200 million people worldwide died in the initial pandemic. It is one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. The Mongol Empire did not cause the Black Death in the sense of deliberately weaponizing disease, though the Kaffa incident does indicate at least one instance of deliberate use. What the Mongol Empire created was the infrastructure that allowed a regional disease to become a global pandemic. The roads, the trading posts, the relay stations, the patterns of regular movement across previously isolated regions. All of these were products of the empire's construction, and all of them served the plague as effectively as they served trade. There is a grim irony here. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, the period when the empire's roads were safe and trade flowed freely across Eurasia, was also the condition that made the pandemic possible. The same connectivity that allowed Marco Polo to travel from Venice to Beijing, that allowed Chinese silk to reach European markets and European silver to reach China, that knitted the world together in ways that would have seemed miraculous to anyone from the century before, That same connectivity was the mechanism by which a steppe bacterium killed a third of Europe. China's population, which had been perhaps 120 million at the beginning of the Mongol conquest, may have declined to 60 or 70 million by the 14th century, a decline caused by the combination of conquest, famine, and disease. The populations of Central Asia and the Middle East also declined severely. The demographic consequences of the Mongol period, including the pandemic it enabled, shaped the human geography of Eurasia for centuries. The decline. 4 Khanats, 4 stories. The decline of the Mongol Empire was not a single event. It was a process spread over roughly a century that played out differently in each of the 4 successor Khanats. Each fell in its own way, at its own pace, for its own combination of reasons, which is perhaps appropriate for an empire that had always been a coalition of disparate entities held together by the gravitational pull of a shared identity and military tradition. The Ilkhanate, covering Persia and Iraq, was the first to collapse in an absolute sense. The conversion of the Ilkhanate to Islam under Genghis Khan in 1295, a conversion that was sincere and politically significant rather than merely nominal, changed the nature of the Ilkhanate's relationship with its subjects, but could not resolve its deeper problems. The plague hit the region hard. Agricultural systems damaged by the original Mongol conquest never fully recovered. Succession crises destabilized governance. By 1335, the Ilkhanate effectively dissolved when the last effective ruler died without a clear successor, and the territory fragmented into competing local dynasties. The Golden Horde's decline was slower but equally terminal. The horde reached its political and territorial peak in the early 14th century under Khan Uzbek, who converted to Islam and presided over a sophisticated court at Sarai that was, by contemporary accounts, one of the great cities of the medieval world. But the plague devastated the steppe population in the 1340s and 50s, disrupting the pastoral economy that underpinned the horde's military power. Then came the catastrophic series of succession crises known as the Great Troubles, a period of rapid-fire changes of Khans in the 1360s and 70s that shattered the horde's internal coherence. The arrival of Timur in the late 14th century, whom we will discuss in the next chapter, delivered devastating blows that the horde could not recover from. By the mid-15th century, the Golden Horde had split into several smaller Khanates, the Kazan Khanate, the Astrakhan Khanate, the Crimean Khanate, and others. Even the third of Muscovy renounced tribute in 1480, and the last vestiges of the original Golden Horde were absorbed or destroyed by the expanding Russian and Ottoman states over the following centuries. The Chagatai Khanate, centered in Central Asia, had the most complicated trajectory. It was always the most internally fragmented of the major Khanates, the one most torn between its nomadic steppe traditions and the settled urban civilization of its western territories. By the mid-14th century, it had effectively split into an eastern portion that remained nomadic and Mongol in character, and a western portion that was more settled and Islamized. Neither portion achieved lasting stability. Out of the wreckage of the western Chagatai Khanate would come Timur, which we will address shortly. The Yuan Dynasty in China lasted until 1368, and its fall was in some ways the most decisive. The Yuan had always governed China as outsiders, maintaining a hierarchical system that privileged Mongols and Central Asians over Han Chinese. Over time, this created structural resentment. The Yuan also suffered from the same plague that devastated the rest of the Mongol world, with Chinese populations already severely reduced by the original conquests. Fiscal difficulties mounted as the dynasty tried to maintain its military power while managing a declining economy. By the 1340s and 50s, massive flooding of the Yellow River created a humanitarian disaster that triggered widespread rebellion. The Red Turban movements, millenarian Buddhist and Taoist-inspired uprisings, swept across central China. From one of these, as we know from the history of China, rose Zhu Yuanzhang, who would found the Ming dynasty. In 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang's forces captured Dadu, Beijing, and the last Yuan emperor fled north to Mongolia. The Yuan court continued to exist in exile on the steppe, claiming the title of Great Khan and the right to rule China, and is sometimes called the Northern Yuan. But China was gone. The Mongol experiment with Chinese governance was over. What remained on the steppe after the Yuan's expulsion was a fragmented Mongolia, divided among competing Chinggisid princes who occasionally managed to unite behind a single leader but never recaptured the cohesion of the early empire. Mongolia reverted in many ways to the kind of fragmented tribal world that had preceded Genghis Khan. The great unification was undone. Tamerlane, the last echo. And then there was Timur, sometimes called Timur the Lame, in Persian Timuri Leng, which became Tamerlane in European accounts. He was not a Mongol by descent, but he claimed Mongol heritage through his mother's line and presented himself as a restorer of the Mongol tradition. He was a Turk by language and culture, a Muslim by faith, and a man of extraordinary military genius and stunning violence. Timur was born around 1336 in the Chagatai Khanate in what is now Uzbekistan. He rose through the political chaos of the fragmented Western Chagatai by a combination of military brilliance, political cunning, and the willingness to do things that other ambitious men found too extreme. By 1369 he was the effective master of Transoxiana, the Central Asian heartland, and had begun the campaigns that would make him one of the most feared figures in the world. Timur's campaigns covered an enormous geographic range. He conquered Persia, the Caucasus, northern India, the Levant, and Anatolia. He's responsible for some of the most horrifying acts of deliberate mass killing in medieval history. The towers of skulls he reportedly constructed outside conquered cities were not merely propaganda, but a deliberate choice to communicate the cost of resistance. When he sacked Delhi in 1398, the death toll was catastrophic, and the city did not recover for generations. When he destroyed Baghdad again in 1400, a city still recovering from Hulagu's destruction a century and a half earlier, he reportedly ordered the construction of 123 towers of skulls. The scale of Timur's violence rivals and possibly exceeds that of Genghis Khan himself. Historians estimate that his campaigns killed perhaps 17 million people, perhaps more. His defeat of the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara in 1402 is one of the most extraordinary individual battles in medieval history. The Ottoman Empire, which had been expanding into Europe and had recently destroyed a massive European crusading army at Nicopolis in 1396, appeared unstoppable. Timur destroyed the Ottoman army and captured Bayezid personally, setting the Ottoman expansion back by a decade and arguably saving Constantinople for another 50 years. Timur died in 1405 at the city of Otrar, the same Otrar where the massacre of Genghis Khan's trade caravan had triggered the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire nearly 2 centuries earlier. He was on his way east, planning to conquer China, which had been the ultimate prize that had eluded the original Mongol Empire since the Yuan's expulsion. The symmetry is remarkable. Otrar, which started the great western expansion of the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan, was also where the last attempt at a new Mongol-style empire came to its end. Timur left behind the Timurid dynasty, which was culturally remarkable. The Timurids were patrons of Persian art and architecture, and their capital Samarkand under Timur's grandson Ulugh Beg became a centre of astronomy and scholarship. The Timurid period is often regarded as a renaissance of Central Asian Islamic culture. But the dynasty itself fragmented quickly after Timur, and by the early 16th century it was swept away. One descendant of Timur who escaped the Timurid collapse was Babur, who eventually found his way to northern India and founded the Mughal Empire, which itself claimed both Timurid and Chinggisid heritage, and which would go on to be one of the greatest empires in South Asian history. So in a way, the Mongol tradition had one more chapter. Just not on the steppe. The steppe itself fell quiet. The great days of nomadic empire, which had stretched from the Huns through the Turks, through the Mongols, through Timur, were ending. Gunpowder had changed the military calculus. Settled states with cannon and muskets could now defend against cavalry in ways they had not been able to before. The age in which mobile pastoral peoples could routinely project military power against settled civilizations was drawing to a close. The grass grew back. The fires went cold. The steppe returned to being the steppe. The legacy. What the Mongols left behind. The question of the Mongol legacy is one that historians have been arguing about for 8 centuries, and will probably keep arguing about indefinitely. This is partly because the legacy is genuinely complex and contradictory, and partly because it touches nerves that run deep. Questions about violence and civilization, about destruction and creation, about whether the ends can ever justify the scale of the means when the means involve killing millions of people. Let me try to lay out the different dimensions honestly. The destruction was real and staggering. The Mongol conquest killed, by the most conservative modern estimates, tens of millions of people. Some regions of Central Asia, the Middle East and China lost a majority of their populations, either through direct killing or through the secondary effects of famine and disease. Cities that had been the intellectual and economic centres of their civilizations, Nishapur, Merv, Urgench, Baghdad, Kiev, Zhongdu, were reduced to rubble, and took generations to recover, if they ever fully did. The irrigation systems of Central Asia, built over centuries and essential for agriculture in that arid environment, were damaged so badly that some regions never regained their pre-Mongol agricultural productivity. The population of the Middle East in 1400 was probably still lower than it had been in 1200. This is not a footnote. This is the scale of demographic catastrophe we're talking about. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, with its translations of Greek philosophy and science, and its original scholarship in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature, whatever exactly was lost there, and the sources disagree on the details, represents a genuine cultural wound. So the case against the Mongol legacy, in purely human terms, is overwhelming in its severity. And yet, the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace that prevailed across most of the empire for much of the 13th century, created conditions for exchange that were genuinely unprecedented and that had consequences lasting long after the empire itself. The Silk Road, which had always existed in some form but which under the Mongols became genuinely, systematically safe for long-distance travel, allowed the movement of goods, ideas, technologies, and people across Eurasia on a scale that had no historical precedent. Marco Polo's journey is the famous example, but there were thousands of merchants, missionaries, diplomats, scholars, and travellers making similar journeys in both directions. Technologies moved along these routes. Gunpowder, invented in China, moved westward through the Mongol network and transformed warfare in Europe and the Islamic world. Paper, already known in the Islamic world, became more widely diffused. Chinese porcelain techniques spread. Persian and Islamic scholars brought their mathematical and astronomical knowledge eastward to China, where it influenced the Yuan court's observatories. The Mongol Empire was the greatest exchange mechanism the pre-modern world had ever created. In governance, the Mongols introduced certain principles that influenced successor states significantly. The yam, the postal relay system, became a model for later empires, including the Mughal, Ottoman and Russian systems. The Mongol approach to religious tolerance, which was partly pragmatic and partly reflective of the steppes' traditionally pluralistic spiritual world, created an environment where multiple faiths coexisted under imperial protection. Nestorian Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Confucians, Taoists, and followers of the traditional Mongol shamanic practices all found space within the empire. This is not to say the Mongols were champions of modern pluralism. They were perfectly capable of religious violence when it served their purposes. But the institutional tolerance was real and notable for its time. The Mongols also had a consistent policy of protecting merchants and trade caravans within their territory. Robbery of merchants was a capital offence under the Yasa. This sounds almost comically ironic given that the empire was built on conquest and took what it wanted from conquered populations, but the distinction between subjects within the empire and enemies of the empire was sharp and real. Once you were inside the Mongol system, the protection was genuine. The safety of the trade routes was not a PR exercise. It was an economic policy, because the empire's revenues depended on trade flowing freely. The Mongol Empire also left profound marks on the political geography and culture of the regions it touched in ways that persist today. The boundaries of many Central Asian states were shaped by the Mongol successor Khanats. Russian political culture was influenced by the 2 centuries of the Tatar-Mongol yoke in ways that historians debate but cannot dismiss. The Turkic languages spread significantly under Mongol patronage and military expansion, which is why the Kazakh, Uzbek, Kyrgyz and other Turkic peoples of Central Asia speak languages that trace their expansion partly to the Mongol period. In China, the Yuan Dynasty's period shaped the administrative geography, some aspects of the legal system, and the cultural memory of China in lasting ways. The Chinese concept of the empire as a multi-ethnic entity, rather than purely a Han Chinese state, has roots in the Yuan period. The Mongol routes through the Yunnan region and into Southeast Asia opened connections that persisted long after the Yuan itself fell. The demographic collapse caused by the Mongol conquests also had, paradoxically, some long-term effects that increased per capita wealth in survivor populations. This is deeply uncomfortable to say, but historians have noted that the dramatic population decline in China and Europe contributed to labour shortages that gave survivors more economic bargaining power. In Europe, the Black Death that the Mongol roads facilitated was one of the factors that gradually improved the position of peasants relative to lords. Not because anyone intended this, but because you cannot have feudalism with the same structure when a third of the labour force is dead. None of this is an argument that the Mongol conquests were good, or that the deaths were justified by the consequences. It is an argument that history is not simple, and that the largest empire in the world left behind effects that are genuinely mixed, some catastrophic, some generative, and most of them woven together in ways that cannot be cleanly separated. The Mongols also left behind something more abstract but no less real. They demonstrated what was possible when the barriers between civilizations were forcibly lowered. They showed, at terrible cost, that the world was connected, that what happened in Mongolia could reshape Persia, that a disease from a Central Asian marmot could kill half of Europe, that technology from China could change the face of warfare in a completely different civilization. The world had always been interconnected in ways that its inhabitants did not fully appreciate. The Mongols made the interconnection catastrophically visible. When historians write about globalization, they usually start with the European age of exploration in the late 15th century. But there is an argument, a serious argument, that the first great globalization was the Mongol period. Not a globalization anyone would have chosen, or that came with any of the benefits without the costs, but a moment when the world was, for the first time, really comprehensively connected, and the trade routes that the Mongols maintained, the administrative practices they developed, the connections they forged, these did not disappear when the empire fell. They persisted in modified form. The Ottoman Empire built its dominance partly on Silk Road trade that the Mongols had established. The Russian state that would eventually emerge from Muscovy absorbed administrative traditions shaped by the horde. The Mughal Empire brought Timurid culture to India. The Ming Dynasty of China, founded in reaction against Mongol rule, nevertheless incorporated many Yuan administrative practices because they worked. The empire died. The world it made did not entirely die with it. There is also the matter of Genghis Khan's genetic legacy, which is both a fascinating piece of modern genetic research and a darkly humorous window into the nature of conquest. A study published in 2003 found that a specific Y chromosome lineage, present in roughly 8% of men across the former Mongol Empire, that is, roughly 16 million men at the time of the study, appears to trace back to a single ancestor who lived in Mongolia around 1,000 years ago. The researchers identified this as almost certainly Genghis Khan, or his close male relatives. The mechanism for this distribution was straightforward, if disturbing. Genghis Khan and his male descendants had very large numbers of children, including through the enslavement of conquered women, and their lineage was distributed across the empire through conquest. This means that somewhere in the neighbourhood of 1 in 200 men alive today are direct patrilineal descendants of Genghis Khan, which is extraordinary information that prompts a range of reactions depending on where you are sitting with it. The legacy of the Mongol Empire is not a comfortable thing to hold. It requires sitting with contradictions that do not resolve neatly. The greatest land empire in history was built through some of the most comprehensive violence in recorded human history. Its roads carried both silk and plague. Its peace was purchased at an almost incalculable price in human life. Its rulers practiced religious tolerance while conducting massacres. The man who started it was born with nothing, was abandoned by everyone who should have protected him, and built something so large and so lasting that you cannot understand the modern world without accounting for it. 8 centuries later, we are still in its shadow, in the genetic information carried in the bodies of millions of people, in the administrative traditions of states that replaced or succeeded it, in the demographic absences of populations that were destroyed and never fully restored, in the religious and cultural boundaries of a Central Asia whose shape was moulded by the Sanatis, in the trade routes and the plague routes and the patterns of connection and exchange that the empire created and that the world inherited. The steppe grass is still there. The Onon River still runs through northeastern Mongolia, and somewhere under that grass, in a location that has been secret for 8 centuries, the man who built the largest empire the world has ever seen is sleeping in an unmarked grave. We have travelled a long way tonight. From the cold banks of the Onon River, where a boy was born clutching a blood clot, across the steppe and through the mountain passes of the Caucasus, down into the great Islamic cities of Central Asia and the wheat fields of Hungary and the river deltas of Vietnam, back across the vast plains to China, and then slowly, gradually, to the quiet grass of the steppe once more. The fires that lit up the horizon above burning cities are long cold. The towers of skulls have crumbled. The yam stations that once allowed messages to cross continents in days are gone, overgrown, remembered only in the records of travellers who passed through and wrote down what they saw. The silver bells on Genghis Khan's great white standard have long since fallen silent. What remains? The grass remains. The sky remains. The vast, star-crowded sky of the Mongolian steppe that looks the same tonight as it did in 1206 when a white banner with 9 tails was raised and a man who had been born with nothing and survived everything became the ruler of the known world. There is something in the Mongol story that is almost too large to hold. We reach for the numbers: 100 nations conquered, tens of millions killed, 4 million square miles at the empire's peak, and the numbers do not really convey it. They are too abstract. The scale is too enormous for the human imagination to process the way it processes things at human scale. What stays with me, at the end of all of this, is not the numbers. It is the individuals. The woman Holun, who held her family together in a steppe winter on foraged roots after everyone with power had abandoned them. The general JB, who admitted he had fired the arrow and was rewarded rather than punished for his honesty. The Vietnamese commander Tran Hung Dao, who defeated the most powerful empire in the world by understanding it well enough to use its own principles against it. The unnamed scholars of Baghdad who carried the texts of the House of Wisdom in their heads, even as the building that housed them burned. The Mongol Empire is often treated as pure force, as a historical phenomenon that simply happened, like a natural disaster, to the world. But it was made by people, by a man who had learned as a child what abandonment felt like, and who spent the rest of his life rewarding loyalty with absolute extravagance and punishing betrayal with absolute finality, by generals who were brilliant enough to be given remarkable independence and disciplined enough to use it well, by administrators who came from every civilization the empire touched and who figured out gradually how to keep something so enormous from simply flying apart. It flew apart eventually. All things do. The largest land empire in the history of the world lasted in its unified form less than a century. What took 2 generations to build took another 3 to fully disassemble, and what was left behind was not what had existed before. The world after the Mongols was a different world, more connected, more traumatized, more aware perhaps of its own interconnection, of the fact that events on one side of the earth could reach the other with a speed and completeness that earlier generations could not have imagined. We live in that world still. As you settle into sleep tonight, I want to leave you with an image rather than an argument. It is the steppe at night, which is where all of this began. The grass is silver in the moonlight. The fires have been banked. The horses are quiet, breathing soft clouds into the cold air. Somewhere far above, the stars are doing what they have always done, wheeling slowly overhead, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. The people who slept under those stars, who were born there and lived there and died there, built something that changed the world more thoroughly than almost any other human project in history. They did not intend to change the world in the ways that mattered most. They intended to conquer it. But history, as always, took what people intended and made something more complicated and more lasting out of it. The empire is gone, the steppe remains, and beneath a sky full of stars in an unmarked grave somewhere in the grass the story sleeps. Let your breath slow now. Let the great distances of tonight's journey settle. Let the names and the battles and the cities fade into the background, like fires seen from far away, like echoes of a drum heard across miles of open plain. You have travelled far tonight. You have seen the beginning of something enormous, watched it rise and roar and fracture and fall, and now the night is quiet, the grass is still, the stars are bright, and there is nothing left to do but rest. Thank you for being here tonight. Wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is in your corner of it, I hope this found you somewhere comfortable. Sleep well.